Welcome to another episode of Matrix Assassins. I am one of your hosts, Velo.
And I'm Nicole.
Nicole, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I'm so happy it's Friday. I'm a little tweaked out on coffee, but I'm ready for the weekend.
Yes, make moves on Monday so you can feel yourself on Friday. We are feeling ourselves, especially because we finally launched our website. Yeah.
www.matrixassassins.com. Go check it
W
out if you haven't.
Go check it out if you haven't.
It was a long time in the making, but it's
It
finally here.
it's finally here. Somebody described it as underwhelmingly. What did they say? No. Underwhelmingly simple, yet captivating and magnetic. And I was like, you know what? That is perfect. And that actually is, those words can describe me as well.
I think that's actually what we were trying to go for.
I know. Get all the merch that you could possibly need. It is going to be a brutally cold winter, so I've heard. So you're going to need as many crew necks as possible, and we are so happy to be able to supply them for you. And with that being said, we're going to do a little giveaway. So if you guys head to Apple Podcasts and leave us a 5-star review with an actual review, screenshot it and send it to VLOW, that's VLOW at matrixassassins.com. And Nicole and I will pick 3 lucky winners and we will send you guys some merch on us.
Also, another thing, when your merch comes in, feel free to post it and tag us and we'll repost it. And we can send over a nice little 10% off discount if you want to buy some more.
All right. Well, we just wrapped up a really, it couldn't come at a more perfect time, especially with Mark Zuckerberg rebranding Facebook into Meta. So it really couldn't come at a more perfect time because we had Alison McDowell on, who is a researcher, activist, blogger, talking about the fourth industrial revolution. And in this episode, she really dives deep into what is the metaverse, how it's going to be used in the future, along with like the sustainable development goals and the World Economic Forum, digital twins. Nicole, what did you think?
It was awesome. And she's so knowledgeable on all these topics. She goes in about blockchain technology. We talk about smart cities, nanotech, just everything related to kind of where things are headed right now.
Yes, I totally agree. This is definitely going to be an episode where you're going to want to take out a notebook and take some notes because she's dropping names left and right. And I think that you can revisit this episode 100 times and get something different out of it each time. Before we hit play,
this episode is brought to you by Primal Alchemy. Primal Alchemy is a superhuman optimization brand that unifies ancient ancestral wisdom with 21st century science in order to create a line of premium lifestyle products to help maximize your physical, mental, and spiritual capabilities.
So physically, mentally, spiritually level up. Oh, by the way, I actually just got my cosmic carbon in, my elite shungite. I have it with me right here next to my computer for those EMF protection. And I also dropped a couple of them in my Berkey water filter. So Nicole, are you ready to exit the simulation?
I am.
Let's go.
We have temperatures right now in the 60s. This bag right here.
You don't have to.
Welcome
to
Matrix Assassins.
Two real girls in a simulated world.
Welcome to another episode of Matrix Assassins. Alison McDowell is a mother, dedicated researcher, activist, and blogger studying the working parts of the World Economic Forum's declared Fourth Industrial Revolution and the global takeover of industries and public policies by the central banks, multinational corporations, big tech, and billionaire-funded foundations. So listen up because the revolution will not be tokenized. Alison McDowell, thank you so much for stepping into the game with us tonight. We are so very honored to have you today.
Oh, well, thank you for the invitation.
Yes, absolutely. So I think, we kind of addressed it in your bio, but I think the best basic question would be, how do you define the fourth industrial revolution?
So, I mean, I think at this point, central to the discussion beyond robotics and automation and sort of the rollout of a generalized biosurveillance state, like a global surveillance state, is really this process of using technology to create like a digital counterfeit of life on Earth. Which sounds crazy. Like this is something I've like been getting my hands around like more the last couple months, but really it's not just about making more money, which is part of it. Like sure, they like to make more money and it's not just about tightening up control systems, but literally it is about attempting, I think, to get as much data as possible on living all of life on Earth to turn it into a replica that they can then somehow break the code of life. And that's sort of where I'm at this point, which is not to say it's not continually evolving. But that I think really the people that are running this show want to be God, like that they really want to be God and rule the universe or whatever. And like maybe just dispose of the Earth, like they're kind of done with the Earth and like move on. And where unfortunately, I don't know that they'll necessarily accomplish that, but that we would just be like collateral damage in this larger quest of using our bodies and consciousness as a launching pad to move on, you know?
Right. And like once they get like really like the squeeze, like they just want to squeeze as much data as possible at this point, and then we're just kind of whoop.
Yeah. I mean, that's how I feel. Like, I don't know, again, who knows about the quantum, who knows about like alternative energy or cold fusion or these different things that they're talking about and how much is accurate and how much of it's blowing smoke. Like it's clearly I'm not operating in any of those spaces. I have no special clearance. So all I can do is listen to people with a lot of power and hear what they're talking about. And that's what they're saying they intend to do. The time frame is unclear, but currently there seems to be a bit of a rift within like the resistance community of like, oh my gosh, like everybody who, you know, participated in this medical choice is going to be dead in 3 years. And then the aftermath. Right. And I'm like, I don't think that's the logic of how I see it, which is, we'll just have to see like how it pans out, you know? I wouldn't like to be wrong because I don't mean be, you know, a bad outcome for a lot of people, but like, I think they actually do need us around for a good chunk of time, especially this younger generation. I don't know. I can't imagine why they are building all of this infrastructure for smart cities and everything else if there's not a plan for at least a couple generations of people to continue into this sort of dystopic synthetic reality that they're building.
Yeah, I completely agree. So one of my questions for you is, how did you first get into this line of work that you're involved in the activism that you're working on?
It's really weird.
We love that.
Yes.
I mean, it's really ordinary actually. Like, so I'm in Philadelphia and I have a young adult child who went all the way through the Philadelphia public schools. And so 13 years, and about halfway through Boston Consulting Group, our school district was taken over by the state, and we became a crucible for every bad thing you could do to take apart public education. And they closed 23 schools. Boston Consulting Group came in and did this massive closure and laid off 3,000 teachers. And then I went from being like a mom who would like help at the auction to being like, this is not right. Like I still thought the world was kind of fair at that point, like I had a pretty sheltered life. And I'm like, what's the matter with this? And then, you know, like the more I started digging into the interests, how they meshed with technology, you know, at that point, initially I thought, oh, this is about selling technology. But then I realized, no, it's actually about surveillance. And then over time, I realized like, no, it's actually about mirroring children into digital twins. It just kept moving. And a lot of the work I did, my core work in activism was around public education for about 3 or 4 years. But for the most part, like the teachers and the parents were so overextended, they couldn't really process what I was saying. And they couldn't imagine that it was real. And I kept saying, I'm reading all these reports that say bricks and mortar schools are going to disappear and you're going to have a drop-in center to check in with your counselor to put you on a career pathway. And they would go, that's never going to happen. And I'm like, I don't know how it's going to happen, but these are powerful people, MacArthur Foundation, Gates, Hewlett Packard, they're saying they're going to do it. And like clearly global public health catastrophe, you know, this sort of manufactured the last 18 months was nothing that I had anticipated. Like in retrospect, it makes sense. Like it's actually quite clever, but that was the trigger point for all of these things. So I had moved on from education into this idea of essentially turning people into a commodity of data and then gambling on outcomes of the data, was something that applied not just to students in schools, but applied to people in recovery from addiction. They applied to people with chronic illness. They applied to unhoused people, all of which are issues that are very central to Philadelphia. So I'm like, okay, well, I'll just pivot over here and try to work with people in these other communities. And that's where I was, when the whole pandemic thing was called into play. And I'm like, oh yeah, okay, time to get up to speed on the medical side of things. But I'm not typical in terms of either coming in from like esotericism or like 9/11, or like my path was none of those things. And so I think in some ways I didn't have the baggage of the past history. Like some people are like, where did you come from? Like we have all these people who like know all of the things, and now some of them are MIA on this, and like you show up, like what happened? And I think it's just because I came in another door. But the playbook, like once you get the schema down, you're like, oh, okay, this is how this goes. And you can just watch and see the media roll out and then see how it comes together.
That is so fascinating that you came in that way. Yeah.
And refreshing.
It is. Yeah. I came across your blog, Wrench in the Gears, pretty much right after COVID. And I was so fascinated by the different topics. And even now seeing what your recent blog posts are about, I can't wait to get into those topics. But I think it's so neat that you came in from this different angle and have been able to piece together all these dots and the connections that are made just, from a different perspective. Because I feel like all of us are sort of, on a path, sort of coming to the same realizations, but we just have different like entry points.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I didn't even the more I understand, because early on, the people for whom my research was really interesting in a way that it would never seem to be very interesting in the education setting, which was what I was doing. I'm like, why aren't you interested? And they're like, we're too busy. And I'm like, oh. So it was like people who were in like holistic health, or people who were in like sort of arts and music, or faith communities, and like lots of Steiner people, like, and anthroposophists, which was, I knew of Waldorf schools. Philadelphia has a Waldorf, like I knew like, oh, like they do things with felt and they don't have a lot of technology, but I didn't know anything about Steiner. So like, to me, then like my learning curve was huge. Like, oh, wow, there's all of these other pieces that then when I look back on Philadelphia's history, like has deep connections to this sort of broader, esoteric societies, that are historically documented with Madame Blavatsky and Rosicrucians and Christian mystics and things that are like part of the history, but weren't things I was necessarily paying attention to. So, finding the work of like Roz Ben, who does a lot of work on, how the art tells the story of Philadelphia, and then spending a lot of time like reading Alana Freeland's series, like her Sub Rosa America, really helped me.
We had her on our podcast.
We had her on. She's
amazing.
Yeah. Yes. So like, I'm like, okay, this is a good grounding. I'm like, okay, like a quarter of this stuff in the book is like Philadelphia. So it made me look back at some of my experiences I had in engaging with people in positions of power. And then I looked at it separately. I'm like, oh, there was something else going on there, than just, people in like the way it gave me it reframed things, shall I say. Yeah. When I ended up like doing an impromptu sit-in in the Union League lobby, I'm like, oh, I knew that was really uncomfortable. I didn't quite understand the guy in the bow tie, what that was all about, but yeah. So I just wander around and bump into things in Philadelphia. That's kind of what I do. And then I research. So my background is actually art history and cultural landscape, which is something that totally will not be available to any other child moving forward if this happens. Like STEM all the way, maybe a tiny bit of STEAM here and there, but like it's going to be totally functional. And I would say art history and historic preservation and landscape interpretation are not your typical things, but they really help me both do primary research and then apply it to like looking at layers of history and then understanding a continuum of where we've gotten to this point. Because if you go back several hundred years, it started out in this place, right? And then the logical extension brings us to this moment. It's not an aberration. It's actually a logical conclusion. Which, to me, like that's sort of kind of a challenge for folks in the resistance movement too, because people are like leaning into like the Constitution and the founding fathers. I'm like, but they were all Freemasons and like they set up the Constitution a certain way. So like most people didn't get, like they had a perception of freedom, but it wasn't real unless you can like have enough money to litigate to the top of the Supreme Court. And so
you're saying Trump's not, you're saying Trump's not going to save us?
No. They're all, yeah, life is a drama. Life is a play.
They have all the world's a stage.
They're a stage. Trump was a really good actor. I mean, that's what I wonder. I'm like, gosh, how are they that convincing? Like, and I think it's that they've convinced themselves, because what I'm realizing more and more is that this is information warfare. This is a warfare on consciousness. And a lot of it is about narrative and the stories we live in and the stories we tell ourselves. So I was very late to the game of being skeptical. I was a very obedient, rule following, like striving person who did all the right things for a long time. And then I'm like, wow, all the wrong stuff.
What was like the tipping point for you? Was it, having your daughter go through the education system? Was that the tipping point?
Well, I mean, there was a particular meeting. So they had closed these schools in the spring. And then in the middle of the summer, like late July, so verging on when everybody's on vacation, they were going to have a series of 6 meetings to talk about putting the schools under this report card system. So they've wrecked everything. They've made it catastrophic. Now they're going to grade the schools. And I'm like, what? So I got like 40 people in a room at this meeting where they were probably expecting nobody. And there was like, like a youngish guy running the meeting. And it turns out the people who were funding the whole thing were from the Michael and Susan Delphi. Just saying, like, so the other piece, so that was the first, like, well, that's not following the rules, right? Like that was, and then I realized, like, over the course of the next couple of years, like seeing these larger issues, which had their own, like, as I've come to understand later in the backstory, there are a lot of complexities around that particular engagement. But to see, like, particularly Regina Brave, who was a member of the American Indian movement and was making this treaty stand, and like she's, a Native American elder in her 70s, like a Navy veteran, and these like giant MRAP things coming down the snow, like getting ready to like blow. And I'm like, oh, okay, so that's what we're about. That's what we're about, actually. Like, we're about the power of empire, going up against this older, this elder woman making her treaty stand. Like, oh, okay. So then that like repositioned my whole frame of, okay, so what is progress? Which is really, I think, essential to the conversation where we're at now, because I think that there was some division, probably like going back to the papal bulls, but it definitely within the Enlightenment of a science like man above nature. And now as we're moving into the 4th Industrial Revolution, it's literally, there's this elite group of essentially molecular engineers who've decided that they are going to remake matter to whatever the hell they decide that they want to make it. And that life exists strictly as programmable molecules, which is, it is devoid of spirit and anything sacred in this world. And I think that just went off the rails, and it's something that is centuries in the making. But for me, that moment at Standing Rock, like that final encounter was like, oh, okay, like that's what it's actually about, is this kind of engagement, right? Is sacred feminine versus the empire and the technological empire. So anyway, that's probably those 2 pieces. Like the school stuff was my original, like, oh, this isn't right. These people aren't following the rules. And then this was like, oh no, this whole system is working as it's supposed to, and it's wrong.
Yeah, it was almost like that was the keyhole into seeing the level of corruption. And then once you followed that path, you could sort of see it everywhere. It probably just kept popping up in all these different unexpected places.
Yeah. I mean, for me, like I spent a lot of time following money, because for me, like, for a while, I was using a software called Little Sis. And it's interesting because like Little Sis is funded by a lot of the bad people, including the Open Society and Soros, right? And so I'm so naive, like my learning curve is really giant. And so Little Sis, they would set up these little groups, these research groups in different cities and say, okay, now we're all going to get together and research things. But it was all about Trump. And I'm like, but I'm in Philadelphia, like the people who are wrecking things are the Democrats. Like we haven't had any Republicans for like, no offense, but like, yeah, that's always been run by Democrats. Like if you're going to go up against corruption, it's going to be the Democrats because they're the ones who have been in charge for decades. So like I would do my research, and this is all bipartisan. I'm not saying in any way it's just the Democrats, it's totally both, but in Philadelphia there really aren't meaningful Republicans, and nobody was interested. And I was like, what? But I would make these big maps that were relationship maps, and with this open source software. And then once the Biden administration came in, and most of the stuff like was not particularly partisan, it was just like mapping systems of power, but they weren't the ones that were approved. Like I wasn't just mapping only Koch industries or only the ALEC legislation, right? And so I was mapping these bigger things, and essentially I'd made over the course of 4 years, like 400 maps, which were very labor intensive because many of them had dozens of dots and you had to hand enter everything with links and make these connections and colors, and they were beautiful. They deleted them all. They deleted them all off the website.
Wow.
Wow.
And like at first, like they started closing me out and saying like I was a problem because I was adding legislation and reports in there. It was almost like a mind map. That's how I was using them. Like, well, it's open source. Like I should be able to, I wasn't messing with anybody else's stuff. I was just using it. It was like an interactive bibliography. And they were like, nope. And they kept kicking me out. And so like we fought for a while, and then eventually they deleted 350 maps. Many of which I have on Wayback Machine, but now no one else can get them. So then that was another indication that I was onto the right thing.
Onto the right thing.
Oh,
Right.
absolutely.
But I would follow like Hewlett Packard. So the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, they had several giving areas, and one of them was effective philanthropy, which meant the stuff that I talk about is essentially remaking government, accountable government through public-private partnerships, so that everyone using public services, whether that's education, food, housing, health services, will be turned into this data commodity, both by the government and by the nonprofits that are outsourced, having services outsourced to them. And the Hewlett Packard, like they made it happen. And I could map, I'm like, okay, here's where they bought every single like crowdsourcing platform with these grants. Here's where they bought all of the philanthropy publications. You know, here's where they bought like the women's groups, the African-American groups, the Latino groups, the LGBT, you know, like all of the groups, like $60,000, $50,000 a pop, pretty cheap. They just give them a grant and then like they're in the pocket. And so when all of this was coming out with education under COVID and the lockdowns here, Chromebooks for everyone, Chromebooks, well, most of them are like Hewlett Packard. And I'm like, guys, like, okay, so these are the people who are going to run the public-private partnerships to get the data. This is the same company that's running biometric border patrol in Gaza. They're the same people who are doing 3D printing of viruses, you know, and they're remaking your philanthropy. Like you're installing the surveillance system right in your homes and
Oh,
with
wow.
children.
I didn't even, yeah. So it comes to that level where you think, oh, gee, wow, you know, they're giving a computer to every child to go home with and
Spy on you.
to spy on you and your family and collect all of your data.
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty brilliant. You have to give it to them. It's pretty freaking brilliant. Like,
Well, you would think more people would figure it out, but it seems really hard. And I think that has to do with, well, I'm looking more and more into like sort of frequency weapons, but two, like propaganda, like how people literally get caught in a narrative. And if they give any one piece up, the whole thing crumbles. And so they don't ever change. Like they will never, even when presented with very coherent facts. Almost every single education activist I knew exactly how horrible Bill Gates was on everything about education. He was like enemy number one in public education. And then somehow this happens and people can't see the connection. They're like, you think he's good on public health and terrible on education? Like that doesn't make any sense, but they could never make the jump. I mean, most all of them couldn't. I had to walk away from pretty much all of my activism in order to just stay consistent with what I knew was right. It's really
and
hard.
stay sane.
Yes. So I guess since you brought up the surveillance, one thing that we've both become pretty interested in is smart cities and the Internet of Things.
Yeah.
So can we kind of go a little bit into that? Because then we can go on to talk about, you know, like smart dust and nanotech and some of the things. Yeah.
Well, in Philadelphia, our first smart thing were these stupid trash cans. And that's why I kind of kept thinking like Philadelphia, like, because we're really half-assed about a lot of stuff that like things that people would be more half-assed about things, but they haven't been as much with COVID. So that's been disappointing. It's interesting. So our first Smart Cities grant was in 2011, and it was backed by IBM, which is not super surprising. And I would say if someone, you put it out and said, okay, so what would Philadelphia's first, what would the focus of their smart, was it smart street lights, or is it, different kind of like facial recognition cameras or whatever? And it actually was kids. That's what's so weird about it. It was something called digital on-ramps, and it was about human capital investing. And so it was backed by IBM and then in conjunction with the MacArthur Foundation. And it was all about, it was called digital on-ramps, and it was about getting kids linked into like youth employment and summer jobs. And so this is what I'm saying, like sometimes the smart part, like the key part of the smart thing is the body, is the person, because that's where these human capital futures markets are going to hang on the armature of individual people and communities. And so, ultimately this program that was hosting this summer jobs program, it was the wife of the mayor, Michael Nutter, who ended up as an extension of, when he left office, he was a 2-term mayor, and he went to work for Michael Bloomberg on What Works Cities and selling the idea of smart cities all over the country and maybe in other places in Europe. And it's in Europe and India, but he was the spokesperson, but his wife was doing youth development. So that was our first smart city thing, was like kids, like getting kids hooked in, like LinkedIn profiles, digital badging. And then that program kind of went underground and is now sitting over at Drexel University. And just waiting, I think, for the digital badges to come online, because these people have very long time horizons. This was 2011, right? So 10 years ago, it's just sitting there. It hasn't gone away, but they have to wait until everyone gets their biometric blockchain identity, and then they can start earning their badges, right? And so that's what LinkedIn becomes. So then we got the big belly trash cans, which were supposedly smart, but then I heard that Philadelphia, it was like a squarish trash can and a recycling can. It was supposed to send a signal when it was full. And it'd be like, oh, this is super efficient, because you won't pick it up when it's not full. You'll only go when it's, but I don't think Philadelphia ever plugged them in. Like the sensors never worked.
Wow.
And they're like big and dirty and like sticky. Like they're really like people hate these big belly trash cans. So those were our first ones. And then, so now we're starting to get, and we had red light cameras, and now we're getting a lot more smart street lighting. So LED lighting is going in like that, along with the 5G in many, many places, and have a lot of questions about what the LED lights are for ultimately, because I think it goes well beyond simply just energy efficiency. There are a lot of clinical applications of LED lighting for optogenetics and like photonics that influence cell function and tissue function. Like in connection with nanoparticles. So those have been going in. We actually, this is an important piece for people to know. Many of the smart cities also are framed as like open data government cities. And so it's framed as like this wonderful liberating process. Like the city's going to open up all of its data and be super transparent, and then people can use it to do important civic projects, right? But the reality is that the people who would know how to use massive amounts of municipal data are people with big companies. They're not like the lady down the block is going to use it to map all the public gardens or something. Like, I mean, they might trot that out as like an idea, but really like in our city, the person who lobbied for it, the open data policy, worked for the police department in GIS mapping, and then later used the open data to create predictive policing software that he said then sold back to the city and Chicago and East St. Louis and many other places. So it's a company called Activism, and they had this hunch lab technology, and they hosted like the International Police Superintendents Association that I ended up going to this meeting where they're like, talking about all of this stuff that is connected with domain awareness system and Michael Bloomberg, what he rolled out post 9/11 in lower Manhattan, and these synchronized camera systems with Microsoft. So there's a lot going on. So open data government is not really about like empowering regular people. It's about like a grab of assets by the private sector to often create products that are about more surveillance.
And also you need to be able to have this skill set to even analyze all that data and have like the infrastructure to just kind of, pull it all in and source it. So it's definitely not something that just like the common person could do. And I'm sure a lot of it requires like, some level of like government clearance or, just any number of things, even though it seems open source, like they're using it and it's being used across agencies and probably, like you said, police departments and so on.
Right. And it's interesting actually, because in that meeting, the international police superintendents, so I think it was about 2 or 3 years ago, met in Philadelphia. And so Asavea was hosting a separate meeting at their office, which was, was not too far from my house, and it was open to the public. So I went, and it was, maybe 40 people in a conference room or something. And they were really soft pedaling it. Like I went because there was a guy there with domain awareness system, and I knew what domain awareness system was, and I wanted to see it. And I mean, I looked at him like, no offense, but he was like 31. I'm like, how are you in charge of domain awareness system? You like have your life experience like this. And he's like, oh, don't worry. It's just like Google, like, and you look up police records in the car. It's really not a big deal. And I'm like, no, I know what domain awareness system is. Like you should, if you haven't, you should look it up, because it was developed with Microsoft. And like, I think a lot of actually the Connect video, off
like
of
the
video
ring cameras and that type of thing.
Well, this was even earlier.
Oh, wow. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Like the mounting on your video game, and that you would do interactive stuff.
Yes.
And then that was training all the AI for the gait analytics, because it's not just faces, it's all of the other body movements. And so like essentially all of the video gamers were training the AI for Microsoft then to run like global surveillance programs, right? Nobody knew how to layer it in. But yeah, so they were all soft pedaling it. There was somebody from like NYU's Brennan Justice Center, and they're like, oh, it's not a big deal. It's not a big deal. And then at the end, there was a young guy behind me who was an ex-veteran, and he was saying like, well, when are you going to come up with the algorithms for the white collar criminals, right? Because you've got these predictive policing softwares for, drug dealers on the corner, but you don't actually have them for the pharmaceutical representatives. And I had asked a couple pointed questions. And then the last question was a guy, and he raised his hand, and he was an older guy. And he said, just so you know, the future of policing is facial recognition software. And you have to remember, this is like 3 years ago. So this is not something everybody's thinking about. Facial recognition software, predictive analytics, and drone surveillance, which 3 years ago, that like for someone just to come out and say that, you're like, oh, wow. Okay. And then the guy came up at the end of the thing. He said, oh, that you should go talk to that guy. He's the CIO of the city, the chief innovation officer for the city. And then 4 months later, he was out. He had been pushed out of office, but he was there with the head of Penn security. And the University of Pennsylvania is an incubator for so much of all of this. And actually, like, Penn has very close ties to Israel too. So like the defense tech sector, like Penn has its own sort of part of the city in West Philadelphia and its own police setup and like private policing units. And in that meeting afterwards, the guy from Penn is like, oh yeah, no, we don't even patrol really anymore. We just do it on cameras. Like you have a camera every block, and like to patrol is just someone watching all of the cameras like block by block, and just and then I guess they could deploy someone if they need to, but like it's very high level, like sophisticated level of intelligence. And again, through public-private partnerships, right? Like Penn is refining these as an incubator for these technologies, and then they roll back out, and it's like, oh, we're so great to have this benevolent university, doing these. But I don't think it's all that benevolent.
No, I kind of came to the conclusion that a lot of times these universities or NGOs, non-governmental organizations, obviously are being funded by the government and the military complex, the industrial military complex, to carry out the research and like the legwork for the purpose of then using it, and they can repurpose it for whatever. But it's kind of like they're all in this like webbed network, and it might, like you said, like it's coming from the university, it's benevolent, it's for all our good, but then they're also using that information and probably using it in other ways that we don't always know about.
Yeah. Well, and for me, that's why like my frame around Standing Rock and the like indigenous sovereignty movement is that I think most people are like, well, they would never do that to us. Like we're the people who live here. And I'm like, oh no, they would. You know what I mean? Like they keep people around as long as they're useful to the system. But once
exactly
that use is over, like, no, like the idea of using these systems against domestic populations, like once you fully grasp what happened to the displacement of the people who were originally here and broken treaties and everything else, it's like, oh no, they would. You're not actually that important to them.
But everything is like under the guise. Oh, sorry.
These multinational companies, they have no national, like, it's just corporatism. they're not American companies anymore. They're just giant corporations. And then where this is going with blockchain and decentralized autonomous organizations, eventually, like their goal is just to have a whole run the world on a big computer and call it one giant company. We all work for the company. But it's great.
Yeah.
So we should all be.
Oh, yeah. Let's get into that, because I know you've done some posts on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and kind of, I guess, like talking about where that's all going and how it's connected to the climate crisis. And that also connects with smart cities too.
Right. Well, so again, like so much of it is unlearning, right? Because I came
yes.
and like, if you're like, oh, the United Nations is bad, like, how is that? Like how could that? It's like Sesame.
How could that be? I like studied that in high school. I was on the United Nations,
right,
club. I'm so confused.
And the thing is, like, I would just like at this point, I'm politically homeless, but like I was very liberal, and then I was like, oh no, it's
politically homeless.
I love that term.
And then I'm like, no, not left. Like, where are y'all? Like, I'm trying to do the things you're telling me to do. You're nowhere. So now I'm like, bloop, like I've fallen off, and I'm like, I'm just trying to do what's morally right.
Right. It's like a wild west.
There's a social program for that, I'm sure. For the politically homeless. You should sign up for it.
Just like, I mean, there are no boxes I fit in at this point. There's just no, I'm just trying to find boxes of people who are trying to be at least accountable to their own morality as best they can be. And I'm not saying perfect, but like that's where I'm at. I have no allegiance to any parties at this point. But so the United Nations, like what I realized, because if you actually look at the 17 goals, which how many people would like otherwise, you just don't. You just like, oh, they're goals, they're good. Most, like 2/3 of them are about managing poor people. And there's only like 5 of them that have anything to do with the environment. There's like, an air and a water and but the rest are smart cities, hunger, education, healthcare, justice, like all of these other things. So you're managing the people in relation to nature. And so it's sort of this perfect cybernetic system where you can say, oh, people, you're bad to nature. You stay away from nature. Now, the thing is, what they don't frame is that like, it's not just regular people who are living their lives who like, sure, they might make a couple bad choices about getting a car that doesn't get good gas mileage or, buying too many disposable consumer items. But really the devastating harm is like happening through global supply chains in the military industrial complex and petrochemical companies. And that's something regular people can't touch. And so those things are not going to be really held accountable in any meaningful way by these new systems. So it's not just regular people who are hurting the environment. Like a lot of it is structural systems that are hurting. And so until you address the systems in a radical way, you're not going to resolve the problem. But they will keep people out of nature to say there's no way you can have a beneficial relationship to nature. People just have to stay away. And plus, if you get too close to nature, it's going to kill you because there's some viruses out there in animals. And like, so now you're all going to die. And so it's this Venn diagram that essentially will be served to channel people into these mega cities that they've talked about. Like early on, I fell into finding this document from like the TRADOC, like the Training Joint Operation and Command Division, which they have a mad scientist division. And it was like mega city urban warfare. Here's your guide to megacity urban warfare. And I'm like, what is that? What is that? And like, how are they getting everybody in the megacities? Well, now we know, right? Like you can't go out in nature. Plus we put all those wildlife cameras in so we can stare at the cougars. Not really psyched, that's for y'all. So like get back into the smart city. And then, you have these big areas that are open. And, I know many people have been talking about this for much longer than I have, Rosa Corey and Patrick Wood and, many people in Kripana, like about this issue. Like I'm sort of, the Agenda 21 stuff. But so that's against the backdrop. But like goal 4 is education and goal 3 is health. And so what I realized is this cybernetic loop of turning the children, giving them the Chromebook and saying, okay, in order to qualify for an equitable education, you need to comply with your data analytics. And increasingly, like those data analytics include your social behaviors and your mental health status. And so in looking at all of that, what I realized is that these 17 goals were like the rules of the game. And the rules that were coming, and this is sort of where I was maybe a year ago, like at the beginning of this, where it was focused on social impact finance, which is what we're seeing emerging now. This idea that everything can be turned into a metric and engineered on a dashboard, that will happen increasingly, not just through devices, phones, tablets, Chromebooks, whatever, but through wearable technology and eventually nanotechnology, biosensors. And that we will be put in this game. And the game will be to bet on the outcomes. And that's what I kept finding with the education space is I would follow the money back and I would go, oh, a hedge fund. And I'd follow the money back, a hedge fund. And then I kept thinking, well, like venture capital firms, for whatever, they can be really messed up, but they're selling something, like theoretically, like they're selling a service or a product, like they're investors who are selling a thing. The hedge funds are just gambling. They're totally just gambling. So how is it that all of a sudden the education stuff, in the UK, it's called the ARC, absolute return on kids, right? Like they just lay it right out, ARC,
Wow.
return on kids, right? And they're betting. And I thought, well, that's not good because you can bet both sides. Like anybody who paid attention to The Big Short knows that the people who made the most money bet that everything was going to be really crappy. So once you start betting on the futures of kids, that's a problem.
Oh, that's such a problem. Like you're shorting kids.
Totally. Oh, look, you're addicted. I made a whole lot of money. I bet that you were going to get addicted. I bet you were going to jail. Yay.
I bet on your failures. Wow.
Yeah, no, but that's what's coming. I mean, that's what they're setting up. And so what was so crazy is that, I feel like I was put in Philadelphia for a certain reason. And so the rules of this game beyond Agenda 21 and the Rio Summit, which kind of laid out the framework, the contours of the game, the real specific data metrics came out of something called the Global Impact Investment Network, or GIIN, like GIN, which is like a genie kind of, right? GIN, they play with words a lot. And that was set up by the Rockefeller Foundation. So like no big surprise there. And the person who set it up, who was the head of the Rockefeller Foundation at the time, and this is like right in the lead up to the last global economic meltdown, is Judith Rodin, she was the president of Penn, University of Pennsylvania, and she left and she became head of Rockefeller. And then she set it all up. They went to Bellagio, they had meetings, they said, okay, this is the new game. So, we had this last collapse and like, we know that the rich are going to get richer. So where do we put our capital now that we're not like real estate is out, like housing? What's the next biggest thing? And really the only next biggest thing was human bodies, natural life, really like life on earth. So whether that's human life or financialized nature, that's the only thing that was bigger than real estate. And so that's what they did. And so essentially they framed out the game within the Sustainable Development Goals and within these impact metrics that were set up by something called the B Lab that was also funded by Rockefeller out on the main line outside of Philadelphia. And they set the rules because no one's going to play the game if they don't clearly understand the rules, if there's not a consensus. UBS, Goldman Sachs, Deutsche Bank, JP Morgan, they're not going to, Santander, they're not going to play unless the rules are clear. So that's the role of the Rockefellers. Like they got the rules, the impact metrics set up. And then later, like a lot of people say, like, who is the they? Like when you say they, what do you mean? And I would say, well, for me, at least at this phase, if you look up the Impact Management Project, that's 2,000 of the world's largest asset holders. And some of those are very rich people. Some of them are sovereign wealth funds. Some of them are pension funds. Goldman Sachs is in there, Bank of America, Omidyar Network, like these big, big players. Some of them are health systems, right? Kaiser Permanente, your insurance money, all your insurance premiums are going to one of these funds. Like all the pension money is going to these funds. Like the teachers' pensions are literally being invested in funds to give robots to the kids so that they get the data to make the payments on the investments for the pensions for the teachers. So like the robots are going to displace the teachers out of a job for the benefit of the pension funds, but then the robots don't pay into the pension fund. So it's all going to fall apart eventually anyway. All these teachers who are like, let me just hold on for 3 more years until I get my pension. I'm like, guys, robots are not paying the pensions into pensions. It's all a Ponzi scheme. But for now they can't see that. So they're like hanging on, thinking it's going to be okay. So I guess that's the framework is that the Sustainable Development Goals set the terms of the game, the impact metrics sort of further refine the rules. Everyone is on board. That's coming through the Impact Management Project. A lot of it is framed under the ESG, and that's what you're hearing. Like the New York Stock Exchange just had this new asset class for nature. The environmental social governance, that's what ESG stands for. Like BlackRock got the contract for the EU to set up the banking terms. All of the investment screens are going to be linked into the ESG investment things, and it's going to run the impact markets. And then a lot of that is also related to carbon. So they will be managing how people can participate in the economy of consumables, like consumer goods, and also mobility, because it's all going to be framed within a carbon economy, carbon trading economy. So the idea of the carbon trade is not just going to be emissions trading, which was sort of a scam in and of itself, but it's going to be like with blockchain identity and with your blockchain digital identity being linked to all of your transactions in the smart world, they can start applying metrics about use and inputs and outputs that will further refine how you can participate in society, really. And so that's the other piece of it.
So it's basically the infrastructure that's being laid to create this system that basically is going to be a social credit score on some level, because we're going to be linked to a system where our behavior is being modified in order to gain something or lose something almost. You know, how they're rolling some of that out in China. I wonder if that's sort of what's happening behind the scenes, I would guess.
Well, I would just say, like, my frame is that, like, if you look at the origins of the FICO score, like, it's convenient to put it on China, but we actually did it first. Like, for the most part, like, people who are harmed by these credit scoring systems, it's maybe not as upfront. Like if you went through divorce or you have student loan debt or whatever, like people don't talk about it as openly as having a social credit score, but like a lot of it, we were the ones who got it set up. So it's all very fluid. Like it's who's running it.
Right,
Silicon
right.
Valley running
It's
China,
like
China running the Silicon Valley.
Yes.
And like a stepping stone. For our listeners, I just wanted to list some of the sustainable goals, just so our listeners, so essentially this is like the rules of the game. And so just some of them are no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, reduced inequalities, affordable and clean energy. And so, you know, the motif in all of those is obviously they're wrapped in really great sounding packages, like for the welfare of human beings. And you can also see this like liberal agenda being manifested in today's society, like equality. So you can kind of see how these like sustainable goals are like being weaved into like almost every aspect of our lives right now through like the media, through liberal agendas and all of these narratives. So I just thought that.
And I think like, honestly, like we would all want people to not be hungry, you know,
obviously.
Like,
yes.
So the thing is, like when I was doing my education work, I found like I watched a lot of really boring videos. And so this one was about an impact gathering in Utah. A lot of this stuff is connected in Salt Lake City. There's a lot of connections between technology, the ARPANET, state intelligence, and the LGS church and biotech and all sorts of stuff in Salt Lake City. But the Federal Reserve is also central to all of this, the San Francisco Fed in particular. And so Ian Galloway was at this winter conference about impact investing sponsored by Sorensen at the University of Utah. And like they had this whole thing and it was about youth incarceration, or, you know, and that was sort of the focus. But in the end, in the Q&A, there was a woman in the audience who said, well, I work for the Salt Lake City Food Bank. And like all of these programs that you're talking about, like sound really well and good. But if people are hungry, you're not going to get very far, because like that's a fundamental need, is that people are not hungry before you can ask them to do anything else. And children in particular, that was what she said. And so then the response from Ian Galloway of the Federal Reserve was essentially, well, you know, with these pay for success contracts, the profit in the deal is based on a cost offset. Okay, so I know that's a bit hard to understand, but like in the pre-K deals that they're doing, universal pre-K, the cost offset was special education. So they would say, oh, we know how much it costs to give a child special education services for a year, and it's expensive. So if we give them preschool and they don't need the special education, you can take some profit from the difference. Like pre-K is less expensive than special education. So there's going to be a gap and we'll give you a bit of that money. And that's the cost offset is the special ed. And they all have costs associated with it. So incarceration is a huge cost offset because they'll say, we know exactly how much it costs to incarcerate somebody for a month or a year. And if we can reduce incarceration, look, we saved money. And that is how the logic of this pay for success finance, social impact finance works. So what Ian Galloway said, he's like, well, we haven't quite figured out what the cost offset is to feed children.
Wow.
Okay. So like
Wow.
that is the logic of this. Like he's saying this out loud. He's like, he said, maybe test scores. Like maybe the test scores, like if you get improved test scores, that could be the cost offset. But we haven't worked it out yet. We're still trying to figure it out. And so that's the logic of the world that we're living in. That on the one hand, we say goal 2 is hunger and people shouldn't be hungry. But then the flip side is, okay, so that means that we have a program maybe in a school, because I'm hearing now, like in Nigeria, the UK, that they're having facial recognition for kids to pay for their school lunches, right? So we get all the kids on a biometric digital identity, and then we know who's the poor kids are, and then we get their facial recognition data, and then we make sure, like, I don't know, maybe it's not just test scores, maybe it's diabetes or obesity, and then we can make sure that they only eat the apples. You know, we can program their food, and we can program their compliance, and then like, who knows, like maybe they'll weigh the trash cans and say, oh, they threw the apples away. You know, like there's all of these very robust data analytics that start to factor into like, well, kids shouldn't be hungry. Or like the community school model where they have a school-based food pantry, and okay, so everybody has access to a certain amount in the school-based food pantry, but then you can earn good behavior tokens to get more. So that's where this thing goes. And that's it. Like people should have enough to eat, for crying out loud. You know, like that's like, there's enough resources in this world to take care of people the right way, except the whole system is broken. And so the challenge is to both acknowledge the harm that exists and not dismiss that, but then be able to point out that the solution that they're offering is totally misguided. And most people can't even imagine that there is such a thing as having a digital identity linked to programmable money and your biometric surveillance. I mean, we're getting there. We're a lot closer than we were a year ago, because I was screaming about this stuff like a year ago, April. And now people can see like, oh yeah, these medical passports, I see how this is starting to fit together. But a lot of people don't get it.
I mean, I could see how this could go over a lot of people's heads. Like, how do you even explain this to somebody that has no clue about that all of this is like nefarious agendas are going on, you know?
Well,
where do we start?
Like, baseline is like where I'm at now, because I'm having a lot of these blockchain conversations, and they want to talk about crypto and liberation and central bank digital currency and all these things. I'm like, okay, so like, I don't want to talk about the money. Whatever. I didn't come in through the money door. Y'all came through the money door. I came in through, we're going to put children on surveillance play tables to gamble on their futures. That's the door I came in. So that's what I want to talk about. So do we want to live in the metaverse? Do you know what the metaverse is? Do we know what mixed reality is? Like, do we know what it means to have transactions with physical space? Like a transaction with your front door, a transaction with your toilet, a transaction with your refrigerator, a transaction with your car, transaction with the bus. What does it look like to actually have every single thing you do in your life transactional and tracked and then managed in the context of cybernetics? And once you realize that mixed reality world, this digital simulation world, is essentially comes out of military R&D, like is a full-on military program. Always has been, always will be. It could be fun, could be convenient. You know, I'm not perfect. I have a Gmail account and I made a Google map and whatever, but like, I do know that it's ultimately military technology, and I'm just teaching the AI everywhere I went in Austin to talk about blockchain, which is really messed up, but right. That's perfect. But like, I know it, like I can admit that that's what it is.
Awareness
so,
is
like,
key.
Do we want to live in this metaverse knowing that it is a choose your own adventure where all of the adventures are written by the military and the hedge funds? And it could be really fun until one day it totally is not fun. And they can flip the switch whenever they feel like it. And that's the question, is like, for me, and I think a lot of people could understand that, like they understand gaming, they might not understand all the nuances, but we can say like, if you walked out your front door and you realized that you were in somebody else's game, like in a very, and a lot of poor folks like do know that like it's a game, like there's a game afoot, but, and they know how to like the rules of navigating the game. But, you know, one of the things I learned in Philadelphia, there's a professor at Wharton, the business school, his name is Kevin Wereback, and his focus is blockchain and gamification. And so he's doing the whole talk to like the Wharton alumni and whatever on YouTube. And he's like, so, you know, a lot of people don't even know there's a game, and a lot of people are in the game and they don't know the rules. And so what you need to know is you need to be the designer of the game. So if you're an alum of Wharton and you're, you know, like that's what Kevin says to you, be the one to design who makes the rules. That's what you got to be. So all the people bumping around in the mixed reality video game didn't make the rules, maybe don't even know it's a game, and don't realize that the rules can change on a dime. It's computer code. Doo-doo-doo. That thing you could do yesterday, you can't do that anymore. And you won't know till you try. And then they say, oh, my QR code on my phone doesn't work to get on the bus anymore, right? Like, and so I think that's a very simple way of saying, like, before we do that, and it's one thing for us to decide it for ourselves as like grown ass people. It's another thing to say, we are building that for 3-year-olds, and they can't knowingly agree to that. And the things, because literally with this nanotech that they're coming up with, like I just found this crazy article about robots training trees and like some really crazy stuff, like cyborg botany. MIT is working on like nanotechnology in plants. They can't know. Like Robin Wall Kimmerer is someone who is an indigenous biologist who I really respect, who's written a beautiful book called Breeding Sweetgrass. And she's like, be a good relative, and like, we're the young siblings and we don't know what the heck we're doing. And so we should not be putting nanowires in plants and turning them into computing systems. They can't consent to that. And so even though like people may not know all the stuff, I think it's how you frame the question, like how you frame the story. And if what you say is like, yeah, what if you realize that all the gaming environments, like all of the animatronics at the amusement parks that you go to are developed by the military,
right?
And then like be out to get you, and it's not actually a movie. I think people could get it and say, no, we're not going to do that.
Yeah, because even with the smart cities, like in a sense, you know, the movie Minority Report, where they're predicting crime and like trying to persecute crime before it happens, like that's basically what this is all leading up to. In these smart cities, if it can all be surveilled and they can just like send out a ranger drone to take care of the situation, it's just kind of, or they could use AI to predict like the behavior of a group of people. It's almost like, where is our free will in that anymore? Like, is our behavior going to be so micromanaged and tied to this system based off of the decisions we have to make just to survive? You know, so it's almost, it's crazy.
Well, and I've been looking some today into like frequency. I mean, and Alana talks a lot about that. Like, you know, there's no natural weather, and like sometimes you just don't even know if the way people behave is not being significantly influenced by outside forces. And
oh, definitely.
Absolutely.
I'm all into that.
Yeah.
You know, I've had situations, like very personal situations, where people, it was like a flip got switched, you know, like, or things that just didn't make sense. And then I just think, well, how do we even know if people, you know, I sort of joke with some of my closer friends, like, if I ever start acting really weird, like, will you tell me? Like, because maybe something happened to me. But yeah, so it's not just prediction, but okay, so this is a conversation I've had before, but about the children, because I think a lot of what there's a huge focus in the research world and in directing philanthropic money, predatory philanthropy money into executive function and wearable technologies in young children. And I kept thinking, well, and this isn't young children who maybe have neurological problems. These are just normal kids. And then they want all of this information. And I'm like, why? And then I realized that in the metaverse, which is this mixed reality world, all of the information is being pushed out at once. And it will be overstimulating, because you're not just interfacing with the world. You know, like sometimes you space out, or you don't notice things, or you notice certain things and not other things. And that's how you operate in the world. But if everything was like shouting information at you at once, I mean, my sense is it would be a lot like, you know, hearing people talk about folks on the spectrum, right? Like they get oversensitive to
Yeah.
stimulation, right? And that the metaverse is going to do that to everybody, right? And so those of us who already have a certain way of being in the world are going to have a harder time reconfiguring our neural patterns to fit into that. It's going to be really hard, like that whole digital native kind of thing, or digital immigrant. But for the younger kids in this 2030, 2050 time horizon, where they're talking literally about living outside of physical mind and body and time and space, that's the Japan Moonshot Project.
Oh, wait, can we get into that a little bit?
Yes.
So, but like they need to bring the toddlers into that. And I think this executive function is to actually adjust physiologically, neurologically, their mind into the metaverse world so it won't be broken by it. Like those of us who are like going to try to accommodate to the metaverse, you know, like we're not ever going to fit in, but those kids, they can bring them in neurologically through neuroelectronics, engineer them to fit in the metaverse in the way that older people can't. But if you imagine, so there's something called augmented cognition. And the military's been working on this for a long time. And there's a guy, Alexander Singer, who was with Star Trek, actually. And he made this film for the Institute for Creative Technologies, which is out of USC, which they were working on synthetic people. But it was about like a scenario where you're in a situation room and you have this wearable device on your head that would mediate information flows, like these massive information flows. And then it would make screens larger or smaller depending on the importance of the information. And you would have like 6 different displays. And it was being mediated through this augmented cognition device. And what I realized is that like that's the metaverse, is that there will be, through your digital twin that's being created of you, they will optimize that digital twin to exist in the metaverse, to manage you for whatever outcome they think, like, you know, in this case, it was like dealing with some cyber attack, but not just that, maybe it's just like getting to the bus stop, but there will be a digital twin and say, this is the best way to do that. And then they'll project through the blockchain ID, like through your digital, like into you to exist in the metaverse in that way to optimize you to that outcome, whatever that outcome is. If that makes sense. It's like an engine, you know, that they've got like these digital twins of engines and they optimize the engine and they get the settings right. And then they apply the settings into the actual engine, like a USB port. But imagine that for the metaverse is that they're optimizing the twin of you. And then they're saying, okay, this is how you're going to do it. And then they project it into your physical body. And so the information you need to experience the world in that way, that optimal way, is what you see, is what you experience. And I know this sounds crazy, but
no, it's not. Yeah.
No, not at all. I'm just, is there going to come to a point where it's like, you can't even distinguish what is real and what is not real?
Well, that's
like where reality starts.
Who's in charge of the twin? Like who gets the settings? Because I don't think you're doing the settings. Like someone else is running the settings. Is that the
someone else? Yeah.
What is, and then how do we know that it's not already happened? I mean, that's
exactly. Yeah,
I know. Exactly. A lot of this kind of sounds like
does this mean this is already here?
A lot of this kind of sounds like simulation theory. Like, and there's a lot of parts where, you know, I think it's like Nick Bostrom, he mentions like there's 3 parts to simulation theory. And like one of the things that like in order for simulation to have already happened is like, did our ancestors think that it was going to be okay? Like, would we, hold on, what is it? Is it, I think I have it right here. Well, eventually these simulations will get so good they will become indistinguishable from reality. And assuming humanity doesn't destroy itself, technology will keep on advancing and these simulations will continue to get better. But will our ancestors would have thought like, oh, like maybe this, like, would we agree upon it? And obviously looking at like what's going on right now, are children agreeing to these simulations being played on them? No. So, I mean, it could be fair game that like we might already, you know, my digital twin is chilling in the metaverse right now, like having a conversation.
It's like a violation of natural law almost. It's not like a consensual situation that's happening.
Exactly. And I mean, for me, that's why situating things within like the indigenous piece is so important, because I'm like, we shouldn't be over nature. like we should be within like webs of reciprocal relationships to whatever that is, like, and I think that there's a sacred element to that, and that I think what's unfolding now is very much about spirit and soul and sacred practice. However, and I don't think that there's one, like, I'm not the kind of person who would say, oh, there's only one and everybody has to join my team. Like, I think whatever that is meaningful in people's different cultural practices. But you know, it's tricky because all of the institutions, like many of the religious and faith-based institutions, have been corrupted, not the least of which into this social impact investing scheme that is like one of my major focuses. But yesterday I was looking at I don't even know how I fell into it, but it was a panel discussion of this guy, Pierre Teilhard Desjardins, who lived in the late 19th century up until the 1950s. And he was a French Jesuit priest who was a paleontologist and spent a chunk of his life in China. And he was part of like the people who discovered the Peking man. And so he was the person who posited the noosphere, this idea of like this like layer of consciousness like around the earth. And he's, I guess, credited for being one of the first people to theorize artificial intelligence, like early on in that cybernetics, like World War II era. And, you know, in his view, it was all about like love, and we were all going to like come together in this sort of ascendant, you know, unified field of consciousness and like evolve into this new thing. And so at this 60th anniversary, I think, of his death, like these people had gotten together at Georgetown, right? So this is not just some flaky dude. I mean, he's getting feted, you know, at Georgetown with these important people, several of whom are connected to the Philadelphia region, like later, like,
wow.
where are they in Philadelphia? But, you know, everyone's like, oh yeah, we're all going to ascend, you know, and we're all going to join with the AI and it's going to be great. And I'm like, no, it's not, because it's all run by the military. And like,
It's all run by the military.
Yeah.
It's just walking right into the trap.
Right.
Yeah. But, you know, this woman is a professor, like the one woman who was speaking, she's a professor at Villanova and part of this Christogenesis project. And they call it the Omega Point, where everything converges. And like, this is my cultural landscape piece, but literally Villanova is a 10-minute drive to the office of the B Lab, where they have all the impact metrics for the social impact deals. And, you know, it's these layers. So it's not just, I think that the impact investing scheme and this whole idea of the Internet of Bodies and the sustainable goals is to get enough data to trigger the singularity. But they need a cover story for it. They just can't say, well, would you please just give us all your data? They're going to say, hey, we're going to rule the world in peace and love and equity and justice. And so everybody, please put on your wearable technology so we can make sure to keep everything fair and right. And isn't it great?
Right.
And trust us, because we're people of faith, you know, and, you know, and it's not just the Jesuits, because, you know, central to this, like Israel is way up there in terms of transhumanism, and the Mormons have their own transhumanist contingent that are tied in with online education. And, you know, I mentioned the Japan Moonshot Project. So there's a lot of different moving pieces that are converging towards a human plus like universal consciousness, but it feels coercive. It feels not like
right.
It's
almost like the masses are being used as the experiment to perfect the technology that ultimately they're going to want in order to extend their lives, you know, or to merge with the singularity. It's like they need this entire world to be hooked into this system that's surveilled and tracked and, you know, experimented upon to perfect it for themselves. And then they can just take over all the resources and hopefully, you know, maybe hopefully not, but like eliminate whatever is useless so that they can just like go on and do whatever they want to do.
Right, because if we're like going into smart cities by droves in these like concentrated areas, I mean, the world is massive. So there's all of these resources that, you know, they'll have access to and we don't.
Yeah,
and
I think
the other thing is like, oh, go ahead.
With the sustainable goals, I think that's a big piece. I think they're basically, from what I've heard, it's consolidating control over these natural landscapes. So consolidating control over like the land, the sea, the food system. You know, we already know like Bill Gates has bought up 40% of the farmland in the United States. And then there's the whole push for, you know, these artificial foods that, you know, beyond meat. And that's like a whole enterprise in and of itself. I think that's tied in with taking people away from nature, disincentivizing these private farmers, consolidating everything down so that people don't really have control over the natural resources anymore. And then that makes them even more dependent upon the system that's being put in place.
Well, one of the like I shared an image a couple weeks ago on Twitter that was essentially it was the railroads coming through and like with the military killing all the buffalo, right?
Oh, I saw this. Oh my God, I love this
like,
post.
this is it. Because like essentially what that dispossession was, you know, this, we have a manifest destiny. So this new manifest destiny, the way I view it, is a colonization of like all of natural life, like at the nanoscale, like in ways that are almost invisible, but like no less repressive. And so the metaverse is the new empire that's being built digitally, and like it's being taken over in a militarized way, but by corporations. So the way in which the railroads took over indigenous land, like it's with the government backing. So it's like the Defense Department is backing the corporations, and then this new era, it's the telecom. And so there's it was interesting to me to reconsider that the rail lines were not just the rail lines, which is again what they used to kill off the food sources of the plains, you know, Indians, and then remove them onto reservations. So that level of dispossession, the same as Gates taking up all the farmland and making people dependent on the state. But then through the rights of way were the telegraphs. And then after the telegraph lines came, like later on the broadband, like the cablings, like the fiber optics continued to run along those rights of way. So there are the layers of history that are coming, that came on top of the railroad, right? But that we're now being sort of colonized by this new level of digital, you know, empire, you know, I guess that's, so for me, that's why that experience of the reservation systems, not reservations, and then also like the Pixlone dams. So the use of public works projects to create dispossession of like removing, like in South Dakota, those dams, all of the lowland areas that people used to hunt and gather were just flooded out. And then they were just left with upland prairie, which were fine for hunting, but were not foraging. They lost all of those things. And so now the enclosures, again, not just on Turtle Island, but like even in Europe, those enclosure systems that force people then into factories, that's what we're looking at. And the smart cities, in my way of thinking, are the new reservation systems. And so, you know, when
Absolutely.
I went to Tucson, I said, hey guys, like we're in the middle of where the Apache Wars, like that was one of the largest protracted US military engagements ever that no one talks about. 30 years. Like 30 years, the Apache fought to try to preserve their sacred land. And then eventually they lost, like Geronimo, but they were in these hills fighting for their way of life. And I said, you know, at this point, like, it doesn't matter if you're, you know, evangelical Christian or whatever, like they're going to shut that down too, because now you are no longer relevant to the system. Like that level of dispossession that those people had 100 years ago is now you guys, it's all natural humans. That's going to be taken off the books. So, and I don't say it from like a woke kind of level, but I'm just like, that's just the logic of how the system works.
How it's rolling out.
Empire works. Yeah.
Also, have you ever seen that map? It's called the Wildlands Project map.
I think so. It's been a bit, but
okay.
Like the corridors and.
Yeah, it basically shows how this would roll out in the United States. And I'm sure there's probably maps in other places, but it kind of shows where society will be sectioned off. I almost envision it as like an overlay to where like smart cities will be, and how like the natural areas will be sectioned off and like people won't have access to them. And then the only way of travel, you know, no longer will it be cars, but it'll be through like railway systems. And I can kind of just see how like this is the way that it would be implemented, you know, eventually if there is like a great reset or whatever's happening economically, if we have some major crash, I could see that being like the impetus of getting people to consolidate and move into these like concentrated areas and then be put on these like universal basic income type systems to just completely restructure society. If,
yeah.
You know, because otherwise there's no way to conceptualize like how will this happen, especially when we see like these dates that are thrown out there like 2030, 2050. I almost feel like there needs to be some like major event that that kind of sparks this whole movement and mass movement of people, and almost getting them away from like private property ownership and then into these, almost like these in China, like the people have like a tiny space and they're in these huge high-rise buildings and they're just kind of all stacked on top of each other. I kind of see like that would be where that would go with these smart cities possibly.
Yeah. I mean, the hard thing is just imagining it.
Exactly.
I mean, because I will say, like, I've traveled, my family's in sort of suburban North Carolina. Like I go out to Tucson, I'm like, I was out in Texas and I'm thinking, there's a lot of like high-end housing, like people who
Right.
spend like hundreds of thousands of dollars on these nice homes. And like, how is it all going to go away? But then I guess the last 18 months, things have happened so quickly that you think, well, okay, that we're now in a place that things are happening that we can never have imagined that people are finding acceptable. So, I mean, the other element of this, I think, within the smart city framework is that one, our vitality benefits from being in nature and connected to natural systems. So I think like the natural energetics of being in natural light and connected to grass and on ground, like that is part of it, like the weakening of individuals. And I think the AI system, I feel like it prefers structured data, right? So that gives, and that's what the blockchain will do, is to provide very detailed structured data. Like the blockchain, I think, is what is really needed for the digital twinning, because they need the anchor point for everything to hang off of. If everything was siloed and they had to sort it out, it would not be nearly as efficient at scale as what they need. I think that the blockchain, however it comes in, and it's not just going to be the medical passports, it's going to be your digital driver's license or your educational transcript. Like eventually they'll get whatever hook they can and then start to layer on top of it. And that's what is the digital twinning. But if they can keep people in limited physical spaces, like narrow physical spaces, narrow social relationships, I think in some ways there's a lot of focus on impact investing on the very young and the very old. And I think some of that on the young is because they want to reshape them to fit the metaverse. But I think on the other hand, their range of experience is a little more narrow. And so they learn them better. Like that's why they want to put the robots in with all of the care homes, because it's not that the robots are taking care of the people, it's that the people are teaching the robots. The people are teaching the robots how to be old, and the babies are teaching the robots how to be babies. And so it's sort of
interesting. So it's not
experience.
So it's not about like AI healthcare where you have like a robot nurse taking care of you. It's like a reverse. It's like it's teaching the AI about these different life stage developments. Oh wow.
That is my sense. The cover story is that, but really, if you're going to break the code, you need all of these experiences. And so do you want to like make a robot learn me? Like that's going to be a hard thing to jump into. Like no offense, but like my brain is like, all over the place. Like you want somebody who's like baby steps. Like that's why you're giving these smart toys to the children and smart toys to kids on the spectrum and these nurses for older people. It's like baby steps. And then the AI, because that's the thing behind Hanson Robotics, is that those robots have blockchain minds. And so literally when one robot learns something, a skill, boom, all of the robots that are part of that network have that skill. And so you can imagine how fast.
Wow.
Right. And so that's what's so scary about those blockchain brains, is that it's like an instantaneous hive mind of all of the robots. And so the more deployments they have, but they'll start narrow and then they'll expand out. And so I think if they can keep us kind of penned up, both emotionally and physically in limited parameters, we're easier to learn that way. If we were all just driving all over the country and doing all like we would be harder to track down and learn. But if you can be like, oh, I'm sorry, you can only go 5 miles from your house. You can only leave for 2 hours a day. You can only do these narrow things. Then we're a lot more manageable to learn as data sets.
And also easier to, control, to program, to manipulate all of it.
Yeah, well, and the other thing is too, is if you think of the frequency weapons, and that's something Alana focuses a lot about, is like, yeah, there's the big ones, you know, the directed energy weapons, but then there are these other frequencies that are happening through the telecom system. So if you keep people, like if the frame is not mass death, but the frame is industrial livestock production, that if you keep them in a certain like semi-free range pen, you know, you can hit them with the frequencies better than if they were just like all over the place.
Yes.
And then you can use it as a learning lab and then learn it and then apply those. Like, can you manipulate people's emotions? Can you make them angry at each other? Can you make them sedentary? I do have some questions, and this is something I need to get back to, but my friend Steffers, who blogs at A Piece of Mindful, we had been looking into graphene in the water supply system. So that,
okay. I wanted to get into graphene
Let's
with
get
you.
into
So let's
graphene.
go in that direction.
Well, I mean, a lot of people have been talking about, like, I first started, like, a lot of this was breaking in, I think, late June, early July. And so I was looking at like the whole nanoelectronics element, and that's, you know, La Quinta Columna still keeps putting out a lot of good material. And again, it's sort of like ruled by electron microscope. If what we're dealing with is molecular level engineering, the challenge from a system of domination is that if you've gotten far enough that you know how to use an electron microscope, the chances that you're indebted to the system of power is pretty high. Like, it's hard to find like renegade people who both know how to use an electron microscope and like have access to one, like continued access. So that,
Yeah.
like, that's really important. Like, otherwise they could just, it's like, you can just deny the whole thing because it's invisible to everybody else. So I just got back from Texas. Like, we spent a week, we went down to this blockchain conference in Austin. And so I used it as an opportunity to do a lot of field visits around both Austin and Houston. And so what's interesting is for whatever reason, Rice University is like a center of like nano research. And it's a small private, like, it's a very elite small private university. It's not that big. I think they have a couple of graduate programs in like applied nanophysics, but I don't even think they have a PhD program. But they are channeling like tens of millions of dollars of DARPA money.
Wow.
Whoa.
I am not
They have like a whole
What?
medical like research institute that's part of this Texas Medical Center in Houston that like is 60 different medical institutions, like this part of the city that dates to the 1940s, this cancer center, but like has really grown exponentially. And then Rice's biomedical center is maybe 10 years old, but it's sort of an incubator for collaboration amongst many different other institutions, medical schools in this larger medical center that employs, I think the overall medical center employs like 100,000 people. And so when you understand like the economic imperatives of synthetic biology, like that's what I'm talking about. And it's all masquerading as like, we're here to fix cancer. We're here to fix Alzheimer's. We're here to fix,
of course,
we're here like for all fix diabetes, but it's all dual use. And if anybody who listens to James Giordano, like who's the Georgetown bioethicist, like he's always like, yeah, it's totally dual use. All of this neurotech is dual use. And so like in Rice early on, I realized that the work around the vaccine quantum dot tattoos, that was work that was done at Rice, was the fluorescence, like vaccine dot quantum dots, the quantum nano. But then they were working on many other like neural prosthetics. James Tour is one of the professors there at Rice, and he is a leader in graphene development, actually laser-induced graphene. So he has all these videos that are like, we can turn anything carbon into graphene. Like we can turn Girl Scouts cookies into graphene. We can turn dog poop into graphene. We can turn anything. Like, and like I keep thinking, this, you know, cradle to cradle like cycle is like, once you die, we'll turn you into graphene. Like everything is graphene, and it's all like he's patented this laser technology. So he's like, hey, like I can take a ton of carbon for $100 and a ton of like $100 worth of energy and use my laser to turn it all into graphene and sell it for like 60,000, like I can't, like 60,000 to hundreds of thousands of dollars for the same ton of graphene. Like for your base cost of $200 for this. And they're like, anybody uses this technology is going to have to pay us to use it. Right. And so it's crazy. Like when you say, well, why are we turning everything into graphene? Well, it's because some people are going to make a lot of money about turning everything, you know, from Girl Scout cookies to dog poop into graphene.
And so real quick, for those who aren't familiar with graphene, how would you describe what graphene is and what the uses of it are?
Yeah. So essentially it's this first two-dimensional material. And the story is that it was like discovered in, oh gosh, was it 2004? And like the Nobel Prize was 2011, like not that long ago, but it was like, there's a story about somebody pulling like lead off a pencil. So it's like graphite, but just two-dimensional. And it has a hexagonal sort of webbed network. And then it's used for the creation of various elements in nanomachines, like nanotubes, carbon nanotubes among them. And the reality is that people have been working on sort of carbon nano for quite a long time. And my friend Steffers has done some research on that, but back to the early 60s. So I think a lot of this stuff was top secret and then like released, you know, around 2004, and then brought out into the public sphere. So the idea of nanotechnology is that like matter is all these loose molecules, right? Like it's not like, it feels like this table next to me is solid, but it really is just these molecules. And that if you can get down at the nano level, they're like the laws of physics as we know them don't apply. And it's almost like you can do sorcery down there. Like anything goes at the nano level. And like you can, I mean, that's what this guy Feynman, who was sort of the father of nano, he's like, you know, there's plenty of room at the bottom. So if you can get down to the nanopico level, there's all of this space, you can manipulate molecules. And there's this dream of what's called like a molecular assembler, which is like programmable matter that you could just like make something on a CAD machine and a design of anything. And then like there would be molecule by molecule, they would put it together and then manifest it. But the challenge is that they haven't actually been able to figure out how to make the assembly happen. And at Rice, I'm trying to remember the guy's name. He got a Nobel Prize too in chemistry, but he was saying he found these Buckminster fullerenes, these other kinds of carbon nanotubes. But what he said was like, no, you're never going to get that machine because it's too sticky and your fingers are too fat. You'll never be able to move one molecule at a time. It's too complicated. And so essentially what they've been doing, I think, ever since is to create nanomolecules that will self-assemble through the use of frequency, whether that's like an ultrasound or a light frequency, and that they can take these individual pieces, tubes, whatever, and then like with the frequency, make them come together as a nanomachine. And so it's almost like they're doing this now with yeast. Ginkgo Bioworks, so a number of people have covered Ginkgo Bioworks, but they're like programming yeast to be something other than yeast. And it's not just genetic manipulation, it's actually through sort of synthetic biology of like programming cells as machines and creating biological, like hybrid biocomputing machines. So graphene is really important in all of this because it's very strong. It's very durable and it's conductive. And then you can combine it in many ways with other materials in layers and twist it to come up with unique electromagnetic properties. And so one of the things that Tor was talking about with his laser-induced graphene, he was like, look, we can change, we won't use labels on food anymore. We'll just laser a label onto a coconut or a potato or a box. And it's not burning it, it's actually turning the carbon into graphene. And then it becomes like an edible electronic is what they're saying. Like it's electrically conductive and we can use this as a sensor to track supply chains.
Okay, is that what the bio wow. is that the bio barcode thing?
Well, there's it's different. I mean, I think there's the barcode of life stuff, which is like trying to get the DNA sequence on all of life. This is more just like tracking.
Because from what I've heard with bio barcodes, like I don't know if it's graphene, but I think they're using some type of like fungus or something that they're putting into the food to track it through supply chain. So they used an example, and I think it's their blockchain technology too, where you can put this biobarcode into food or engineer it into food, and you could literally take a coffee bean and track it from like where it was sourced to where it traveled to even through the digestive tract. Like you could track it that far through the entire life cycle of production to like whenever it's no longer useful anymore. So it just kind of made that connection when you were talking about that.
Yeah.
With the,
Well, I mean, I think, I don't know that, I mean, I don't think that that's graphene, but that's probably tracked on blockchain.
Yeah.
That's the blockchain. And that's
exactly
a big part of like what Cardano is about too. And that, again, they're part of that whole working with Handsome Robotics in Ethiopia, you know, blockchaining 5 million kids that nobody's talking about.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, I mean, but essentially what, in addition to the food supply, he's saying like, look, we can laser on plastic film and create like really sensitive electronic sensors and batteries. And so when you start to look at wearable technologies and smart materials, like everything can start to be smart and like be energy harvesting and battery producing, because I think what they're going for is something called the Internet of Bio-Nano Things, which is that everything is this ubiquitous sensing computing environment, stimulated environment. But to power that, you're not going to just have like one big power station and push the power out like in our traditional way. You're going to have a decentralized power system. And so like, I think in many respects, all living things are going to start to, through nanotechnology, start to have their biopower harnessed and captured and stored in unusual ways. Like part of that is like nanowires and piezoelectric energy harvest, where they're saying like, oh, you can put nanowires on your eyelids and your throat and in your blood. And like when it moves, it will create electric charge and it will store it. And you'll be able to power your wearables off of that. But I think ultimately the goal will be some kind of dark black mirror.
Right.
It's more than charging your phone. It's going to be like, hey, on the blockchain, smart emergent technology is you. Like you're the
exactly.
And
yeah,
you know, what's so freaky about when you look at, you know, Vantage Point Capital Partners, that's the thing I keep pointing out, like RFK Jr., he's this managing partner in this, you know, venture capital fund that's all about 4IR technologies. And I looked at it early on and thought, oh, here's some biomedical stuff, I'm not sure, but there's a ton about batteries. And I'm like,
yeah. And actually that,
like when you start looking at his portfolio in the context of batteries and smart technology, it looks a lot different. Like
that's actually the firm that's involved with developing these biobarcodes that I mentioned too. So it makes sense.
Yeah,
there's a connection.
I'm just like people.
Yeah. And so is there a connection with that to smart dust?
Well, so I mean, I'm still working out. I mean, Alana's much better on all of like the nanoparticulates, and there's this other guy, Pete Ramon. So I don't claim to, I'm kind of wide and not super deep, but this is sort of my frame, especially within the, like a resistance movement around the injections, is that people are like very judgy on people who maybe made the choice that isn't their choice. And what I would say, and like, I'm not doing it, and so I'm not going to be in the internet of bodies. And like, I mean, Alana sort of makes that clear. It's like, we're all probably kind of cyborg already.
Yeah, we're like already there.
This nanoparticulates has been raining out on us. They're going to, you know, probably program the water, and
we have all the nanoparticles inside of us.
You know, it's in every consumable, like consumer good, it's in our clothes. So I think that like we are already holding like large amounts of these materials in us. Like then the question is, how is it activated, and how can you detox from it? And I think some of it too is sort of a spiritual thing. And I'm like, not to be too loopy about it, but I think mindset has a great deal to do with how you navigate this stuff. Like, because I think there is a bioenergetic element, which is what makes me, what I find challenging. And I'm not trying to be a Pollyanna or to like, I post some really scary stuff. Like I'm not, you know, but I try not to let it totally get me down, or like that it's the end of, or become a nihilist about it.
Right.
They think
Exactly.
that in that low energy space is where they want everybody kept.
Exactly.
And so I'm just like, this is really terrible. And guess what? I'm like gonna go take my dandelions out and say like, no, I'm not doing this thing. And like eventually, like the day may come where, you know, my time is up and whatever. But I'm gonna try to sort of be as pleasantly interventionary as I can without just thinking that there's no hope.
Exactly. I feel like we're both on that same level as well. Just, you know, trying to exist within what's happening and doing what's possible to just bring awareness to it, and to also try to find ways to maybe like counter it or mitigate it in whatever scope of power we have left, you know.
Because to me, I feel like that's the test.
Exactly.
That it's not a numbers game. Like the idea that, I mean, even when I was just doing my education work and I would do more work and I would be like, oh, I'm up against the CIA. And I'd be like, oh, I'm up against Mossad.
Yeah.
It's the Crown. Oh, it's the Vatican. Like, I'm like, oh, it's SoftBank. It's Alibaba. Like, I'm like, how did this happen? That where I'm Oracle? Like, how is it that like everything, like all like the Saudi sovereign wealth fund, and it feels so big, but at the same time, I'm like, it's not like you can go to war with this thing individually because it's a structure. But
Exactly.
if you frame it as a spiritual quest, like given your options, do you try to show up and do the right thing as best you can, knowing that you're going to mess things up, you're not perfect, but like, do you come from the right place? And to me, that feels like the spiritual challenge, you know, that's being put before us. Like, and not everybody knows enough to be engaged at the same level, right? Most people are just like getting by their daily life or whatever. But for those of us who know within what's like we have at our disposal, do we show up? Do we show up and tell Natalie Smolensky, the chair of the Texas Blockchain Summit, that is not that what she's doing means putting children on CIA surveillance play tables for global hedge funds? And if that one little thing, like maybe I didn't really change her behavior, but I showed up and I was the moral conscience to say, this isn't right. This isn't right. And then in the grand scheme of things, if we imagine that there's some greater creative force of the universe, maybe that will be enough.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
and I'm going to just hope that it's enough until the day is over and they're like, oh, you're done. And then I will say, okay, well, with the options I had, I did what I could. And if someone said, how did this happen? They would say, well, Allison wrote it down over there. She knew how it was happening. She wrote it down and now we know. But, you know, I have a friend that I had a chance to spend some time on Lakota land summer before last. And we were on the edge of this water and they were telling me this story of like God, you know, getting ready to like being really tired of the people on the earth and like gonna destroy it. And the eagle said, wait, like, hold on, just let me go check it out before you don't do anything too rash. Hold that thought. And like the eagle flew and like was not good. Like most of it was not good, but like finally saw like one man and one woman who were keeping the old ways. Like they came back and said, you're right. It's not really good, but there's still a few people down there who are trying to do the right thing. And then that was enough. That was enough in that moment to say, okay, well, I want to do it now. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of where I'm just coming from. It's like, not that I'm presumptuous enough to think like I'm the one, you know, but like for those of us who can, if we try, then that's all we can do.
Exactly. And I think it's just finding, I guess, like that saying, finding the others, like finding other people who understand what's happening on this level and being able to kind of piece it together and connect these dots is also a way to bring others into it without, you know, because otherwise, like, it's like you're living this unconscious life, unaware of what's happening and things are just happening and you're just kind of complying and doing it because you don't know like what's happening. You know, it's just kind of that NPC, non-player character existence. You know.
No, and I did that for a really long time. Like that's
and so did we.
So did we. So did
Yeah.
we. I always think about that. Like, what was I doing while all of this was going on? Like during this journey. I think another good question to ask you would be, what are some ways we can implement to choose not to play the game? Like if this is the game and we have to play by the rules or create our own reality, what are some ways that would be like to just not play? Not use Google Maps anymore?
Yeah,
I know.
Rely on my own mind.
Move to remote island.
Move to remote islands.
This is one of the things that I'm trying to figure out. And I'm trying to navigate, because it's also like this weird social media space. And I've like had some lessons that I've learned that were kind of not pleasant in social media space. And like, how do you build like community when, like, honestly, physically, I'm very isolated. Like in Philadelphia, there are not many people who are, in alignment with where I'm at. But like Robin Wall Kimmerer says, like, know your gifts and how to give them. Like, so I would say, like, there's not one right answer, but like, what are the things that you are gifted in, like in relationship to others, and then exercise that in authentic ways. And so I think some of it is about narrative, because we're living in this weaponized narrative. So one of the things I've been trying to think through for the winter is my friend Jason is trying to create like an online platform space that's like outside of the Facebook land or whatever, where we can have some conversations. And I keep thinking, like, I would love to have like a storytelling season, right? Like, and maybe not strictly COVID stories, but like, how do we imagine some other ways? So this woman, Leanne Simpson, she's a Canadian Indigenous like academic, but has done a lot of work around Anishinaabe language and like living like her traditional life ways. And she's very interesting because she's an academic, but she's done a lot of work in like video work and not fiction writing and short stories and like science fiction. So she's like reimagining sort of these near future scenarios and like in very creative ways. And so I'm like, how would we creatively like tell stories of the way through? Because I think the way out is through like an artistic practice or a spiritual practice. And I think one of the relationships that kind of like the door slammed shut, like last month, was with someone who had an engineering framework. And it was hard because on the one hand, like I really had a lot of ideas about engineering, but to me, like when that happened, which was very unexpected, I was like, oh, well, maybe the universe just said like, nope, boop. The answer is not engineering. Just so you know, like, by the way, that part of your journey is over. It's done, like move along. And so like, I'm like, okay, well, so maybe as I understand frequency better, and this is a hard thing because it's not my gift, but I'm like, is it song? Is it story? Is it like, how do we break their hold of frequency on the frequency and on the narrative? And to create space and stories that people can access into and like find the way through. And so my friend Cliff often talks about like what we need to do isn't to run away from this thing. Like there's a scary thing in the basement that's down there. And it's this scary thing that has to do with the Roman Empire and like, crazy maritime slave trade law and the crown and all of these things down there in the basement. And we can't run away from it, because even if we try, like there's going to be another basement wherever we go. But if we go down in that basement and like build a blanket fort with our friends and like light a candle and do, like have a palace of love down in the middle of the basement, like that's the most radical thing. And so I keep thinking like, how do we make that fort in the basement of song or of story or of artistry? How do we tap into the noosphere, of the real one, not the artificial graphenated one, of the ancestors? Like, how do we
the ancestors,
there,
exactly.
Right? Like, how do we get to that place? And, I feel like I'm such an amateur at all this, like, cause like literally I was a mom trying to study school stuff. And like, so I'm learning as I go along, but I'm like I trust my gut, and my gut says that crux is the next phase is, we're not going to war with it. Like we're not actually, and I'm not in any way dismissing people that feel like they're motivated to be in the streets and to take these actions. I'm not dismissing that, but in my sense is, at least in parallel or as a counterpoint to that, is a different practice that could emerge. But I don't know. It's like it's emergent, I guess. Is
exactly. Yeah.
Or maybe this winter. I'm hoping maybe this winter will come out.
like taking this frequency too, because obviously this is like a lower vibrational, you know, these are lower vibrational topics. These are dark topics, and like to be human is like to have a soul, something that artificial intelligence can't take away from us. And having soul and creating art and song and just vibing your emotions higher out of that. I think when you do practice like having a soul and doing soul work and like soul energy, whether that's through song or dance or anything of that nature, it kind of really just will raise your frequency. And if you're around other people, cultivating that with other people and turning the lights on in the basement and disarming all of the scariness, you know.
Transmute,
Yeah, transmute it.
I love this.
Yeah, transmute it.
Send me all these dandelions, right? And like literally, like I went down to Austin and someone from Texas had sent me a cactus pad in the shape of a heart and like some other things. And so like I took it back to Texas. And of course, like I had all of this stuff on my carry-on, like I had sage and cactuses and these little felt dolls. And I'm like, oh, and they're like, I got to go through all this stuff. And like, they were not expecting the cactus, but like I left it outside the Gates Dell, like computer science lab, where literally the guy who's the head of the AI federal committee that is working on he's the head of Sony AI in North America. Like Sony AI is a part of the Japan Moonshot Project, who's like, hey, guess what? Like by 2050, we're going to live outside of body and mind and time and space. And like I brought like not only the cactus, but these little like cedar buds that I had taken to Marian Anderson's grave and Rosetta Tharpe, the godmother of rock and roll, who's buried in Philadelphia. And I brought all of this stuff like outside, and I'm like, this is real. Like there's something that can't be, you and your crazy like soccer playing robots like don't have anything on this thing that is real. And but it was a collective process because it was a lot of things that people had sent me from distances, and so like I was carrying their good intentions with it too. So
that is so neat.
Can you explain like to our listeners what the dandelion symbolizes?
Yeah, well, so I'm just finishing up. I worked for 17 years at a public garden, and I wasn't a gardening person. I was really mostly like a desk jockey managing databases, actually, like our membership stuff. But like I had colleagues, and I was able to spend time on this land and in a really like heavily industrialized area, part of Philadelphia, Southwest Philadelphia. And so like during the lockdowns, I was able to spend some more time actually volunteering, like doing work on the land. And it just came to me one day. It wasn't like I like woke up from a dream or whatever, but I was thinking about the dandelion. I think it was spring, and that it symbolized, like the more I looked into it, it was, it's a foraging plant. So it's a plant that people would gather. It was global. So it was on every continent besides Antarctica. It had this, taproot, right? And so the focus, the thing about the dandelion is it pulls up minerals from the soil. So if there's a soil imbalance, it pulls the minerals up through the roots. That the leaves are used they're good for a liver cleanse, I think, which is anger. So I thought that was really appropriate. And it has the phases. So it's like the sun, which is the flower, the moon, like the puffball, and the stars, which are all the seeds. So it has this whole life cycle, and and it's tenacious, right? It can crack the sidewalk. And especially in cities, because I'm in a city, right? And so it's weird that you see a lot fewer dandelions in the suburbs because it's lawns, but in the city, dandelions are everywhere. I mean, I had someone that I took one down to Tulsa, to Austin, and they're like, here, I found these dandelions on a bridge in Tulsa. They have a little piece of like note paper, and they send me the dandelion, and I take it to Austin. And so it's this like, and it's free. So there's nothing about to participate in this beyond the cost of postage, which is unexpectedly high actually. And I'm sorry about that, but like you can put a few leaves in a letter and send them to me, and then I will take them somewhere. Like I have a bunch that I need to take to New York. I need to take it to the UN and the Lucis Trust. But the last piece about this is that I read that Theseus, or Hecate, the goddess Hecate, fed Theseus on 30 days on dandelions before he fought the Minotaur. And I really feel like the impact investing, the system of domination, is represented by the Minotaur, like the Wall Street bull. And I did a whole big thing, a walking tour of Wall Street area. And with the Wall Street bull, we we did a whole beautiful garland of mugwort and dandelions and things that we left at the Wall Street Bowl. And then someone had made this wonderful dandelion tincture. And like, we couldn't get to the front end of the dandelion, the bowl, because it was like a tourist thing and everyone was lined up for photos. So we all hung out at the business end of the bowl.
Yeah.
And my friend, she put the dandelion tincture right, in the particular area of the bowl. Yeah. So anyway, so that's what dandelions have been to me this past season, is that I just put out a call. I wrote a blog post and I said, if you want to send me dandelions, here's my address. And people did. And, it's been really lovely, because I think, like, even in my household, my husband doesn't quite get me, like, what this is. And, if you listen to the mainstream media, people who are questioning the overall narrative, especially early on, they were framed as a certain kind of person, which wasn't me, right? And I kept saying, people would not be totally sending me all of these dandelions if they were bad people. Like, what bad person would package up dandelions and mail them to me, right? Like, these are people who actually really care in a very direct way about what the future is, and are banking on this. The other hashtag I've been using is like keepers of natural life. Like, we have to keep on to even the humble dandelion, because it's quite powerful. And I think it's egalitarian. I mean, that's it's this machine, it's coming after everyone, but especially within the impact space, it is coming after the most vulnerable communities first. And that's what being in Philadelphia has taught me, is that it's not just about our individual freedoms. It's about our collective responsibilities to one another, both as humans and then to other than humans in the world. Because this synthetic biology thing, this metaverse computing thing, it is a very small subset of very delusional humans that are trying to enact this on everybody else. And no one group is going to be able to stand outside of it. I think it's an all or nothing thing. And those of us who are trying to transmute it are doing it on behalf of life itself, not just like people who we feel are aligned with us. It's for everybody.
One thing that I just kind of came to mind was when you were saying, like, it's being imposed on like these vulnerable communities. The first thing that I kind of thought was El Salvador being the first country to have Bitcoin as legal tender. And I thought that was interesting, right? Because a lot of people would look at that and think, okay, statistics show that El Salvador, I think it's 80% of the people in El Salvador don't have banking or a banking account. And so Bitcoin's going to come in and save the day, and this is going to be revolutionary, and this is going to be so great. But when I saw that, I was like, oh wow, they're
colonizing. Yeah.
They're colonizing. Exactly. So I just kind of wanted to get your take on that.
Well, see, so my first exposure to blockchain was like early on. I think I don't even know how I came to it, but there was a 4-hour presentation. You can still watch it. It's with New America and the World Bank on blockchain. And it was like 2017, and it was 4 hours. And in the middle of it is this guy, Sean Conway, and he's talking about the humanitarian aid being put on blockchain for trust, right? Because there's this also implicit bias of like, oh, you can't trust those people with our aid. But then it went into the pre-K space in Ampley and Cape Town and putting toddlers on blockchain to build social capital. So I started to look into it more. And then I saw there was a short video with, I think it was Bit Fury and Richard Branson. And so Richard Branson was hosting these gatherings on Necker Island in the Caribbean. And they were like these short, like 5-minute videos of like this beautiful Caribbean island with all the private jets flying in, and like all these people on the lanai going, oh yeah, we've got to get all of those global unbanked people on blockchain so that we can improve, grow capitalism. And I thought, oh my gosh, because if you understand the framing around, like a big use cases have been around blockchaining land records. And they frame it like, oh, well, we're going to blockchain all of the land title records because look at all these poor people getting ripped off of their land, right? Like someone comes in and they can't prove that they own their land. Mm-hmm. But then the flip side is that any culture that has a practice of collective land holding, that's an impossibility in blockchain. Like you don't have collective, it's all private to individuals, right? Or private to companies, but it's not like the idea of you know, especially in places like India or Latin America, where you might have collective access to lands, that's all going to go away. So like Honduras was actually an early use case for blockchain before El Salvador. And they were also being a focus beyond blockchain of something called the Charter Cities program, which Paul Romer out of NYU is advancing. And so these charter cities was this idea of having like sort of a carve out where you would have like a corporation run parts of like other people's countries. And like, it's perfect for something like Google Sidewalk, right? Like you're imagining like the Google Sidewalk and Sidewalk Labs in Toronto, where you would just go into a country, especially now with all of this remote work and remote learning. And so you could just like go into somebody else's country and like carve out a corporate zone and run it as a state of exception according to all of your own rules for people you choose, right? And so it's this whole other, like we have to really revisit even like geopolitical boundaries and geofencing, and within the context of these multinational movements, is that increasingly it is full on globalization. And that while people, I think there are people on the conservative side who imagine still that it's like the problem is with immigrants or we need to close the borders, it's like, no, like they can geofence you with your wearable on demand. And the immigrants that they're imagining through this globotic labor are not actually going to come to your country anymore. They're just going to run the remote robots. And that is being planned out by the United Nations. Like they have a paper on globotics, which is part of Globalization 4.0, where they're literally lauding the day when Mexican gardeners will run lawnmowers in Texas and cut grass from Mexico, and Kenyan housekeepers will clean hotel rooms in Norway from Kenya through remote robotics. Like that is
what?
Wow.
That is Globalization 4.0. And that's like when I'm telling Peter Vogel at the Blockchain Summit, who's like advancing the Texas blockchain laws with blockchain education transcripts, that's what it is. They're going to have your child put their consciousness into a remote robot, a la Sanctuary AI, and do the work. And they're going to be competing for global peace work based on their blockchain credentials, including their social skills and whatever their social credit score is. Like that's the future that is literally being built right now. And like, I mean, right now, like they've got these Kiwi bots, which is a very early use case. And like, who would think it would start with the stupid burrito delivery robots on the Berkeley campus? But like they have these last mile delivery coolers on wheels. And there's a person who goes to all the fast casual restaurants, puts all the burritos in the coolers, and then people, I believe it was in Bolivia, would drive the robots into the dorms. This is pre-COVID, but like that was their whole business model because they could pay them a tiny amount of money. And that's like the Moonshot project that I was talking about, like that it's the Japan Science and Technology Agency. But the crazy thing about that is they launched in December of 2019. Interesting timing. They're saying goal 1 is that by 2050, we will live outside of a mind and body in time and space, literally. And I have a friend who took his 3-year-old and who took dandelions to the lobby of the Moonshot Project in Tokyo and left dandelions on the leather sofa in front of the screen with all the children in the VR headsets, like, and the sustainable development goals in the lobby. And that's on my website. But yeah, that is all being planned. And then the keynote launches for that goal, it was somebody from the National Science Foundation and the US Department of Energy. So like, that's not just Japan. Right. Literally, like it's our government were the people who were at the keynote speakers. So like, I think there's a lot of stuff that I've been looking into lately in the history of post-war Japan, like the Unit 731 projects, like what was happening in these sort of torture units, and then what happened with these technologies that were like kept off the books during the Korean War and went over to Fort Detrick. And like, I think there's a lot of narrative around bioweapons. For me, I'm more of a terrain theory person at this point than like, I'm not exclusively that there's nothing about germ theory, but I think it's a lot more about frequency and environmental poisoning. And so I think there was other stuff going on in those test labs beyond just the bioweapon narrative that play into this idea potentially of structured water. It's very interesting because Emperor Hirohito and his son were both biologists. There's a lot of water stuff in Japan. And so, you know, that's something about this programmable water and graphene and genetic material is that, like, I think it's not just manipulating the base pairs of DNA, but actually the way in which water interacts in living tissues and that are like relating to consciousness and other things. So I don't have it all nailed down yet. I need to do more work on it, but there's a lot of moving parts. And this moonshot project, it didn't just come out of nowhere. Like this is an extension of decades worth of work around like creating avatars, but I think within the creation of the avatars, also using cognitive neuroscience and cybernetics to try to tap into what they believe consciousness is. Both individual consciousness and global, and where is it situated? Is it mind? Is it in your brain? Is it out there? And how to engineer that. And that is a central part of this avatar life that they're in the process of unfolding, of which part of it is mirroring us through our biosensor technology, like embedding within us and around us nanobiotech to mirror us. But then the ultimate quest is to get our consciousness.
Wow.
I think the other question too that I have is like, you know, this whole thing of like everyone's going to crypto and this is going to be like the biggest like generational like wealth transfer. And what are your thoughts on, okay, like this is going to be the system, this is going to be the rules. Do we take advantage of this system? Like if we are able to invest in crypto, should we? Because like we can make a lot of money that way. Like what are your thoughts? Like do you invest in crypto? Is that a crazy question to ask you?
No.
Okay.
You
kind of
don't
afraid to
invest
ask.
in the open air digital prison.
Exactly. Yeah. How should I restrict
open air digital prison? No.
Yes.
Okay. I
Okay.
mean, the thing is, like, ultimately, money is a fiction, like, too, like
Totally.
that, like it's this fictional idea, and I mean, I think that's one of the challenges that I faced as somebody who's like not a traditional like influencer or journalist in this space, is that like I'm not saying it because like I'm not saying it that I'm better. I just have it's a different economic model. I'm not doing this as my paid work. And so many people who are in the space are getting in some way compensated through crypto. And so once you make that choice, it's very like you are not incentivized in any way to start unpacking the metaverse and blockchain electronic health records and blockchaining nature and all of these other elements, because then your financial piece, like it starts to fall apart, right? And so that all stays at hand's length. But what I'm saying is the metaverse can't scale without blockchain. In my mind, blockchain is not about the money. I would say 95% of the people think it's about the money, but my sense is it's maybe 5. And that's the piece that's rolling out now in all of the layers. Like in Cardano's got this crazy Hydra layer of smart contracts. It's the transactions. And ultimately, money is about rights and privileges, right? If you have money, you can buy things, access. You can buy access to things, access to experiences, access to stuff.
To farmland.
In the world, like UBI and smart contracts, it's all going to be about access. It's going to be about tokens, and it's going to be about script.
Right. They're already having like the energy tokens, you know, healthcare is going to be put on a token. All of that's going to be, you know, blockchain technology. And so.
Right. Like, what is your token? You get up in the morning, you go to the bathroom, and how many tokens do you earn? Like by like what your smart toilet says about you. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to say is like, that's the conversation. And if we're like, that's why for me, the conversation, are we going to live in a military metaverse? Like because that's the pivotal. Like if you're cool with that, then maybe you can start to have a conversation about how blockchain fits into that metaverse life. For me, I'm the one taking the hard line, saying like, I want to have the conversation about are we choosing to put children in the metaverse, knowing that they can't consent to it?
Right.
Right.
Because in my way of thinking, once the metaverse rolls out, there's not going to be many places that aren't the metaverse, because it's going to be mixed reality. And so
when do you think it's going to be rolled out?
For everything, you know what I mean? Like it's going to be hard to roll it back.
When do you think it's going to be rolled out? Like, what are your thoughts of like when they're going to roll out the metaverse?
I mean, I don't know how much it's already like, I mean, people have asked me, like, what does it mean to be blockchain, right? And like, would you know? And that's part of it, is that like, if you look at Cardano's like intentions towards Africa, like they put 5 million kids on blockchain, like, and they want to put all of Ethiopia on blockchain. But in the other countries, they're looking at doing it through their telecom system. So like you sign up for your phone contract and suddenly you're on blockchain. Like one of the other ones is like I don't know if it's microloans. Like there were different ways in which like you could literally sign your phone contract and then end up with a blockchain identity. I don't know to what extent health systems are going to start to convert their health records into blockchain. So when we were in Austin is an ID 2020 pilot city, smart city, everything. Like it's highly militarized. I mean, it's for such a liberal ass city, like with the music scene and all this stuff, like is a total military city. But it's, you know, it's a really attractive city, but it's total defense department, like tech stuff since the 50s. And so they have this ID 2020 pilot where they put unhoused people on blockchain, literally with just a QR code. Like they got their biometrics, put them in the database. They didn't have a smartphone. They just literally gave them a laminated card with a QR code on it. Now this is pre-COVID. So like nobody really even knows what QR codes are. I mean, limited, like most people do not encounter QR codes pre-pandemic. So those people were blockchained. Did they know like, so, but within that, we went to the Dell Medical School, which was one of the first like ground up medical schools that has been built in the last 50 years. And it's this elite boutique medical school that's in connection with this health system that is part of Ascension, which is a Catholic affiliated health system that evidently is very big in Texas and maybe regionally. And Ascension had like cut a deal with Google to give all the data, all their patient data to Google for their AI and didn't tell people. And it actually went to congressional hearings like several years ago. But if Ascension can do that with Google with not notifying anyone, and they're also within this larger MyPass, that's what the blockchain unhoused people like program, what's to stop them from just blockchaining everybody's healthcare records without telling them? Like, I'm not sure. So like, this has never been done. Like, I wish I could be more definitive about it. And that's why I keep trying to just try to explain the basics. Like, we need to know what the metaverse is. We need to know about a digital twins. We need to know how it runs on blockchain and that it's about the contracting, because literally like Yale Law School has been doing like sessions on blockchain smart contracts. These people like this Vinay Gupta guy in London, like they know it's about the contracts.
So what exactly are the contracts, or how do they work?
So essentially it's embedded code so that if the conditions are met, then the action is allowable. Right. And so it could be simply that, and it's all framed as private and decentralized, right? So everyone's like, oh, it's decentralized, it's private, it's cool. But what that means is like when you go to the grocery store and you have to wave your QR code or your sensor like in front of the door to get in, that you have your whatever medical status is what they say it needs to be to get in the building, like it can be private on blockchain, but that doesn't mean that you can get in without waving your phone in front of it, right? And that someone watching will know if it opens or not. Like they'll know if you have the code or not. It doesn't really matter if on the back end so there's a contract in there. Some of it is programmable money. So like a lot of that is being framed within the central bank digital currency. But way before that, like the Illinois Blockchain Task Force, they were trying to figure out how they would use blockchain for public assistance. And they said, oh, great, well, we can code food assistance. And so that if you buy the stuff we want you to buy, we'll incentivize it with an extra payment, right? So if you buy the apple instead of the hamburger, we'll put more money in your account, which everyone looks at and goes, well, that's really smart because we need people to eat better. But what it doesn't look at is the person on food assistance may live in a food desert. They may be working multiple jobs and they can't get to a store. They may not have access to, they may be living out of their car. Like there are many reasons why you might not be able to make the optimal choice. And eventually, we all know how budgets work. Like they'll cut the food stamps so that you can only get by if you always make the right choice, which may be impossible. Or eventually it could be that based on your DNA profile, we're telling you that you have to get the genetically modified lettuce salad because you're pre-diabetic. And so we've decided that this is what you need to buy with your programmable. And they actually have that. There's this DNA nudge band that I found early on in the pandemic that was coming out of University College London, I think, their R&D division, that you would shop with your DNA. Like it was a wearable that you would take to the grocery store and it would tell you what to buy. And then everyone's like, well, I would never do that. And I'm like, it's not going to be optional for some people.
Right.
It's going to be like, if you get food assistance, you shop with your DNA nudge band and they tell you what you're allowed to buy. And it's not just like, oh, you can't get a 6-pack of beer. It's going to be like, no, we're going to assign you precision nutrition with our free 3D printed veggie burger or something, you know? And if you don't want that, tough, you just go hungry.
Then don't sign up. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then you'll be stuck in a smart city in a casita, like Internet of Things freight container, like on your, exercise workout, meet your credits. Like it is very Black Mirror. And it's like they have the technology all in place to do these things, but it's not quite yet socially acceptable. And I think they can't quite scale them. Like they can do small pilots. And so what I'm hoping is that if we could tell the better story about what this actually is outside of the COVID narrative, because that is just done. Like we can't really talk to anyone on the other side within the COVID framework anymore. And that's why I feel like much of this is just wasted effort, because
and by that,
change their position.
Okay, so by that you mean it's to the point where like people have kind of picked their sides and there's no way to convince one or the other. Yeah.
Unlikely. Because at this point, if you've participated, if you've gone along, then you are now an accessory to the bad things that have happened. So for you to back out of it, it means that you have to either acknowledge that you were misled, which makes you feel dumb, or that you were guilty, right? In it, including harming children. And nobody wants to know that. Like, that's just how the human mind works. Nobody wants to own up to that. And so you would rather live a lie than like come back out of it. So my sense is like, let's figure a different story. Let's talk about nature, right? Like, let's talk about this other stuff that maybe we can agree on. Can we all agree on that we should not be sticking nanowires into plants and then calling that green and sustainable so that, global hedge funds can make money and displace people? And, like, can we decide that? Like, and maybe from that conversation, eventually we'll work our way around to like, yeah, remember when we were doing that to ourselves? But like we've got to pick another thing to talk about. And which is not to say that other stuff isn't important or valid or whatever, but like, that's not going to get us where we need to go. And so to me, like, the keepers of natural life idea is like, okay, they want us to be like, you're jerks, you're selfish, you're doing this for yourselves. And as long as we are intent on the free dom meaning domination program, they're going to be able to characterize us that way. Like, let's set that aside and say, no, we are the responsible ones. We are the people who are standing up saying there are some really profane things happening in the natural world under the name of environmentalism, which we do believe is right and good, but being handled in very terrible ways. And let's pull the curtain back on this. And like, we're doing the responsible thing, not just for our personal benefit, but for the whole world. And then in that, it flips everything. And I don't know if that makes sense.
It does.
No, it totally makes
like
sense.
A tiny little voice in this whole thing, but I'm like,
no,
story, because it's all interconnected. Eventually,
it is.
It is, and it turns people's heads, honestly, because people are so COVID fatigued, and like that's one thing that made me turn my head towards your work was it was like, oh wow, she's talking about crypto in like such a different way. Like, I'm so intrigued. Like, it's just it's a pattern interrupt at the end of the day, and I think that is important. And I think we can agree. There are things that we can agree on. I think sometimes it's hard to talk people out of their freaking Apple Watches. It's just like that one is. I mean, we're already like cyborgs. I don't know, but they track my steps, and now I have the Aura ring, but it tracks like my sleep, and I get better restorative sleep when I wear it and track it. It's like, oh gosh, here we go.
I know, but like, I think like literally And this is what, and I keep evolving, right? Like it kept getting new layers because it's so big, it's this hyper object. But like Michael Nutter was this mayor that was like a wonky guy. It's interesting because he was actually at like a hip hop DJ. So like all of these big concerts came, it was like a frequency thing too. Like he was kind of like this nerdy guy who did like DJ stuff too. So there's like a frequency thing going on. And so like he came into office as the education mayor. And actually for a while, like his child was at my child's school, like it's a magnet school in the city. And like they were, just regular parents and that was his frame. And, I went to a number of events and he wasn't really about education because our schools were totally being privatized under his administration. But what I realized later is that, and when the first time he came into office, it was January and he had an open house. Now, Philadelphia has a giant city hall. It's like one of these largest masonry buildings in North America. It's a Second Empire building. It's quite unique. And actually Roz Ben talks about it. He's like, City Hall is a Babylonian temple. It's like, it's a Babylonian temple to Urbana. Wow. And it's this crazy building. And actually on the north corner where everybody goes in and out to the building is actually the Masonic Hall, right? So like there is something going on. So we had this big open house so everyone could come and shake his hand, which no one had ever done before. And I actually was such a loser at the time. Like we actually we stood in line with and again, these lines were like blocks and blocks, like you waited 2 hours, like our child. So, third grade or whatever. And they're whining and it was cold or whatever. I'm like, this is important, like civic duty or whatever. Like it was so snowed. And a couple years later, they would have like a essay book, writing prompt, like for elementary school, you have the morning writing prompt. And I was flipping through and and I don't even know why the teacher would ask this, but it was something like what was something bad that happened to you as a kid, And I'm looking and it's like, my parents made us stand in line to go shake the mayor's hand. And I thought, wow, well, that's kind of like a first world problem, right? Like that's the worst
Definitely.
thing.
Exactly.
Parents make you do this thing. But then I realized later, as I'm doing all of this stuff, that it was actually put in place by this guy, right? Under all of these progressive sounding frames. And he was the education mayor. But then what I realized is it's all inverted and the education is actually the teaching the AI. It was actually setting up a giant child sacrifice through the educational system to offer up all of their data through the technology to feed the machine learning system. And so if you understood it as this ceremonial thing at the Temple of Urbana to say, I am your education mayor, I am here for the children. And then everyone lined up to say, yes, yes, yes. The energetics of that, in the moment, we are sacrificing the children to the metaverse that my kid was totally onto something at the time that this was totally wrong. And I'm not saying that they knew it, but there was something, came out of that with a really bad feeling that at the time I kind of blew off and I didn't understand. I kind of was like, haha, that's kind of funny. And now I'm like, oh my gosh, my kid was totally right. Because from a symbolic thing, if you understand that all of digital education is an inversion where the children are the teachers and their emotional states, their raw emotional states are being fed into the machine to replicate a false consciousness, especially traumatized children, like low-income children, Black and brown children, that's pretty profound.
That's so profound.
Yeah.
I've never thought about it that way, that the children are the teachers.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
That's...
Because they don't have a filter. Like my friend Rolo pointed out, he's like, kids don't have the same filter that adults do.
They have their innocence.
Right. And it's authentic.
Authentic, yeah. They're not jaded like we are.
So, yeah, Michael Nutter. My education mayor. I take it back.
So before we wrap up, we do have a couple of final more questions. So do you have any detox or health methods that you use to counter what we're facing in the environment?
I'm not really good at that.
That's totally okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, my friend Deepti, she's always like, keep salt under your bed.
Oh.
You have salt under your bed. She's always asking, do you have salt under your bed? And she's awesome. And so I do keep a dish of salt under my bed. And then she told me to get one of these crystals or things. So I have this.
What kind of crystal is that?
I can't remember.
Yeah.
I'm good at it.
I appreciate the honesty.
I wish I could say I was better. Like I could probably be like, there are some people who actually execute these things better than I do. I'm mostly like, what's the next thing? What's the next puzzle piece? That's kind of my thing. I mean, like I try to eat real food. Like I'm not any particular, but like we've been doing a community supported agriculture thing since for like 15 years. And I never really like thought about it that much. Although now it's all online and you order it, which is kind of like, now I think about it, it's not good. But yeah, I'm probably not the most super healthy person. And literally there's 5G on either end of my block. And I have the shittiest cell phone reception.
Exactly. Everybody
Right,
says that.
exactly.
But yeah.
Crap.
It's like, it's not
Everybody
about
says that.
reception, but that's what people, it's funny because people say like, oh, I've never had worse service than I do now. And it's like, okay, because it's probably not about better service.
Let's put 2 and 2 together, everybody.
I have like really good ear ringing. Like my ear ringing is really solid lately, but yeah, not so much the other stuff. Yeah, there are people who are far better at the health stuff than I am, but
That's okay.
Yeah.
Are
then,
you re-
so before the last one, then the next question that we sometimes like to ask is, what message would you like to leave our audience with as a way of like partying, like anything on your mind or anything that you just want to put out there before we close with the last question?
I would just say like these folks, like they imagine at this nano level, like they can do magic. That's what I'm saying. Like, and I do feel like within the defense sector, there are occulted knowledges, there are hidden knowledges that they are using to advance their agenda. But at the same time, I think that life stands with life. Like that's what I try to, that we have a line into, like, we don't have a manual for how to access that the way that they imagine, right? Like they imagine that they can use their electron microscopes and like force their way into these spaces and manipulate things, or, use these machine technologies. But I think that it's all yin and yang. So, there's the equal forces. So I think when we step forward, we have to realize that there is a lot of energetics in the world that exist beyond our perceptual state. And that actually the world doesn't want to end the way these crazy people think that they want to make it end in some sort of like black goo, graphenated, like burbling thing, that it actually, like, they're rooting for us. Like there's stuff out there that's rooting for us to step up and develop ourselves and be those people that we need to be. And so and that we don't have to have the handbook to be able to get benefit from it. And I think that's the thing I've kind of learned over this past 18 months, and is that there is more than we know, and that it is supporting us. And that in some ways, if you can imagine what's happening as like a journey that you're learning along the way, I mean, what we do now matters. Like that's the thing. Like we could totally live in a time when like whatever we did, nothing really like was going to change anything. Like the stakes were not that high, whatever. But it actually does really matter. And that's pretty amazing. Is like we live in a time where our choices matter, that there are these larger forces that are with us if we can attune to that and try to do the right thing and learn as we go along. And yeah, it's kind of exciting. Like for me, it's like putting the puzzle pieces together. And it's like probably one of the more most intellectually stimulating times that I have my whole life. Because otherwise, like I would be doing stuff, but certainly not learning the amount that I have about the world had this crazy thing not happened. And that, yeah. So I guess that would just be my thing. Like life is on our side.
Yes, I love that.
I do too.
I love that.
So
yeah,
and we have to know all the rules to get to still have that be true.
I love that. They are rooting for us.
They're totally rooting for us.
Totally. I love that.
Mhm.
I mean, I had a conversation with a woman. I'm supposed to give a brown bag seminar on like financializing our relationship to nature, like on Thursday. And I said, you know, and these are people who are like fundraising. And I'm like, I need to get out ahead. So like when the program officers come to offer you these grants, like you can tell them you don't want to give them the impact metrics and why, because they're saying that everything they're doing is about diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And like, if they were really doing that, they wouldn't ask you for all this surveillance information, which they may not be yet, but give it a couple years with wearable technology and biometrics, and they are going to ask. So let me give you these tools so you know going down the road, and then you can do like a jujitsu move. And when they come at you, you like will know, and it will be like they try to cast the spell, and you've got like this shield. You can bounce it back because like we've given you these tools. Like we're just this one step ahead. Because I don't think even the program officers for these foundations want to be the bad guys, really. So they're just doing what they're told.
They're
to
just
do.
doing their job. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so are you ready for our final question?
Yes.
Okay. What is one song that penetrates your soul?
Oh. Well, lately I was so like before I went to Austin, I was doing a lot of listening to Rosetta Tharpe, which I hadn't heard a whole lot of her before. But you know, she was a gospel singer, and you know, she had sort of ups and downs in her life, but she mixed like gospel music and really spiritual music with sort of this rock and roll aesthetic. And so she has this song called "A Clean Train," and it was about like, you know, going to heaven, and that the people on the train like were the clean train, right? Like it wasn't the gamblers or the backbiters, or the, you know, it was. And I sort of feel like that's where we're going. Like we're going to heaven, like however that is. And along the way, we're cleaning things up. So, and it's not always easy, because I think sometimes there's people who got on the train with you and you really got to know them really well, and then they got off at like a few stops
to get
down.
off.
Then they got off. You're like, did you have to get off? Like, you know, but yeah, so that's who I'm thinking about lately. Yeah, Clean Train.
Okay, perfect. I love that. I haven't heard that song, so I can't wait to listen to it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good one.
And the reason we ask is because we have a Spotify playlist. So each guest that comes on will ask that as a final question, and then we compile all those songs into the playlist. It's
cool.
sort of like a side project.
Oh, that's fun. Well, yeah. So like, if you can picture, so I flew into Dallas, and my friend Lynn and we were driving to Austin, which was like 3 hours. So we had Rosetta Tharpe on like the playlist, and I was sewing my little felt dolls, like that I filled with all the rocks and leaves and everything. And so we had Clean Train on, and yeah, we're gearing up. That's what I had on, like outside the blockchain conference. I had like a little speaker, and yeah. Don't blockchain children.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't blockchain children. They're like, what?
Exactly. They're like, I thought it was about crypto. I'm like,
yeah. Like, exactly.
About living in a CIA video game, for crying out loud.
I literally don't know how you're in. I would love to be a fly on the wall, just like your normal interactions from the day-to-day world. It would just be amazing.
My husband is exhausted.
Oh. Well, thank you so much for coming on. We've learned so much. I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and really can't wait to re-listen to it too.
All right. Well, thank you. Yeah. Well, I'm still learning some more stuff. Like eventually I'm getting back to programmable water. So maybe eventually.
Oh, that's so fascinating. Yeah. I want to learn about that too.
Yeah. Well, hopefully you'd come on again and talk about programmable water.
Yeah. Yeah. I gotta get all my ducks in a row. And Quakers. The thing is, like, I'm also like looking into the Quakers too. So.
Oh, heck yes. I'm quaking for the Quakers. Can't wait.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a good night.
All right.
Level complete. Hit subscribe, like, and leave a review for future simulations.